Night gathers over the Rift Valley as if the land itself is holding its breath. The ground is dark with old fire and older stone. Wind moves through grass that can hide antelope lions and small bands of upright primates who do not yet know what will one day be said about them. Beyond the thorn trees, volcanoes brood against the horizon. Lakes shrink and swell with the climate's moods. Rivers shift course. Seasons arrive unevenly. Nothing here is fixed for long, and that may be the first real clue. The story of how humans leave Africa and spread across the entire world does not begin with conquest. It begins with instability. It begins in a homeland so changeable, so demanding, that survival itself becomes a kind of training for elsewhere. Long before there are roads, borders, maps, ships, or kingdoms, there is East Africa broken open by tectonic force sculpted by drought and rain, and crowded with opportunity beside danger. This is not a gentle cradle, it is a testing ground. Forest gives way to patchy woodland, then to open grassland, then back again as climate pulses across thousands of years. Animals move with the water, plant foods flourish, then fail. Lakes expand into rich corridors of life, and later retreat into saline emptiness. For the human line, and for several other hominin lines now vanished, these shifts are not background scenery. They are constant pressure. They reward alertness, memory, cooperation, and movement. A creature that can only thrive in one narrow setting is exposed here. A creature that can improvise begins slowly to matter. The deep roots of this story reach back far before Homo sapiens appears. Africa is not simply the place modern humans come from. It is the place where the long experiment of being human unfolds in many forms. Earlier, hominins walk these landscapes for millions of years. Some climb well, some stride efficiently, some make crude tools, some likely share food, some vanish without leaving more than scattered bones and the silent geometry of broken stone. By the time our own species emerges, the continent has already produced a long lineage of beings shaped by uncertainty. Humanity does not erupt suddenly from nowhere. It is assembled piece by piece in a world that keeps refusing to stay the same. That older world leaves clues in fragments. A jawbone here, a hand axe there, butchered animal bone beside an ancient lakeshore pigment. Stains in a cave, the pattern of a campsite preserved by accident, and then buried for ages beyond counting. None of it tells a complete story. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how neatly these fragments fit together. But what survives in the record suggests a broad truth. Human beings are not born global. They become global by first becoming flexible, and Africa is where that flexibility is forged. The first anatomically modern humans appear in Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago, though even that seemingly simple statement conceals a tangle of uncertainty. There is no single dramatic moment when humanity steps onto the stage fully formed. Fossils from places such as Jebel Irhoud in Morocco or Mokibish in Ethiopia and Herto in the Horn of Africa reveal populations that look strikingly human, but not always in exactly the same way. Some faces are modern, some skull shapes more elongated, some features hint at a long braided process rather than a clean beginning. No single explanation fully accounts for this early phase. The old image of one small garden producing one perfect first pair of modern humans has steadily given way to something less tidy and more convincing, a continent-wide story of connected populations mixing, dividing, adapting, and changing over immense spans of time. That matters because Africa is not one environment, and early humans are not one small tribe waiting by the exit. They are spread across a vast and ecologically diverse continent that includes deserts, coasts, highlands, savannas, wetlands, and forests. Even before any lasting migration beyond Africa, people are already learning to survive very different worlds. Some live near rich shorelines where shellfish and marine foods broaden the diet. Some occupy drier interiors where mobility becomes essential. Some endure in shifting grasslands alive with herd animals and predators. In other words, the future global species is rehearsing at home. Before humans master Eurasia, Australia, or the Americas, they begin by mastering Africa's own variety. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The lives of these early humans are intimate with risk. Infants must be carried through dangerous terrain. Water must be remembered and found again. The deadliest animals on Earth share the same paths to the same pools. A broken limb, a failed hunt, a run of bad weather or conflict with neighbouring groups can push survival to its edge. Yet this pressure produces advantages that are easy to overlook when seen from the distance of modern life. Human beings become experts in noticing patterns. They track seasonality not as an abstract calendar, but as a condition of existence when tubers are ripe, when herds move, when birds return, when fish run shallow, when storms gather over distant escarpments. Memory becomes stored survival. Social knowledge becomes a form of technology long before tools grow sophisticated enough to impress us. And tools do grow more sophisticated. Across Africa, stoneworking traditions become more refined and varied over time. Points are shaped with greater precision. Hafting begins to join stone to wood. Pigments appear hinting at symbolism, body-marking ritual, or social signalling. At certain sites, people exploit marine resources in ways that suggest planning and seasonal scheduling. At others, obsidian and other materials move across distances large enough to imply exchange networks, or at least repeated movement through wide territories. These details may seem small beside the later drama of crossing continents, but they are the real beginning of the story. A species does not suddenly walk out of Africa because it develops legs. It leaves when cognition, cooperation, and culture make movement cumulative rather than accidental. One lesser-known detail changes the feel of the whole picture. For a long time, people imagined ancient humans as trapped within tiny local worlds, barely aware of anything beyond the next ridge. Increasingly, archaeology suggests something more dynamic. Even in deep prehistory, groups may maintain social ties across surprisingly broad ranges. Materials travel, styles echo across regions, information likely moves farther than individuals do. In practical terms, that means a band of humans does not need to discover every danger from scratch. Knowledge can circulate ahead of bodies. A distant water source, a favourable season, a hostile group, a useful stone outcrop, a stretch of coast rich in shellfish, these things can become part of shared memory. The world begins to widen before people physically occupy it. Still widening awareness is not the same as departure. For most of human existence, Africa is enough, more than enough. It offers immense space, rich resources in many zones, and countless opportunities for local adaptation. There is no reason to imagine some constant primal urge to abandon the continent. That older myth that humanity possesses a kind of built-in destiny to spread restlessly until every blank space is filled says more about later empires than early humans. The first people are not imperial strategists. They are communities trying to live through uncertainty. When they move for immediate reasons: water, food, safety, mating networks, competition, shifting landscapes. The eventual result is global, but the motive at each step is probably local. This is what gives the story its peculiar grandeur. The takeover of the planet does not begin as a master plan. It begins as a series of responses to pressure and possibility in a homeland that never lets life become too predictable. A dry period breaks one corridor and opens another. A fertile phase turns deserts into grassland. A coastline offers a chain of edible margins. A population grows large enough that some people drift farther than before. Another group returns, another disappears. Many attempts may leave little trace. Some routes close for thousands of years. The process is messy, reversible, and slow. Looking back, it can seem inevitable. Standing inside it, it would feel anything but. And always Africa remains at the center, not merely as point of origin, but as engine of human formation. Here the body becomes leaner and better suited to endurance across distance. Here childhood lengthens, making room for greater learning and dependency, but also for more complex social worlds. Here communication deepens into whatever early language becomes. Here emotion, obligation, and imagination are tied to survival tightly enough that culture itself becomes part of the species' adaptive toolkit. By the time humans stand at the threshold of leaving, the decisive transformation has already happened. They're no longer simply clever apes living in one region. They're a creature capable of carrying a remembered world inside the mind and rebuilding fragments of it somewhere new. That threshold does not look dramatic. There is no signpost at the edge of Northeast Africa, no ceremonial farewell, no moment when someone says that now the world will begin to belong to humans. There are only landscapes in flux, small groups making decisions under pressure, and generations moving through corridors that appear and vanish with the climate. Some of those corridors lead nowhere lasting. Some end in death or retreat. Some will eventually open into continents full of other hominins, giant animals, ice fronts, inland seas, tropical coasts, and mountain barriers. But all of that lies ahead. For now, the important thing is simpler and stranger. The species that will take over the world is still at home, and home is already teaching it how to leave. What allows one primate species to go farther than any other land animal of its size is not raw strength, nor speed, nor some single miraculous invention. It is a layering of capacities that accumulate over immense stretches of time until they begin to act together. In Africa, long before humans cross into the wider world in any lasting way, those capacities are already taking shape. The species is being built for elsewhere, though no one living through that process could possibly know it. What emerges is not a perfect creature, but a versatile one, physically unremarkable in many ways, alarmingly vulnerable in others, yet unusually able to solve the problems of one place, with tools, memory, and relationships carried from another. The human body tells part of that story. It is easy to underestimate how strange it is. Humans are not powerful climbers compared with other apes, not especially fast sprinters, compared with most four-legged mammals not protected by thick fur, claws, tusks, or armor. Yet the same anatomy that leaves them exposed also opens remarkable possibilities. A long-legged upright gait makes distance cheaper. Arched feet and spring-like tendons help store and release energy step after step. The hands, freed from locomotion, become available for carrying, shaping, throwing, and fine manipulation. The shoulder is unusually mobile. The thumb becomes part of a grip that can turn imagination into matter. A sharpened point, a digging stick, a hafted blade, a woven sling, a container, a fire-hardened shaft. These are not accidental accessories. They are extensions of the body, and over time the body evolves in conversation with them. One surprising detail is how much endurance matters. Human beings are not built to win short chases against antelope, but they are exceptionally suited to sustained movement in heat. Sweating cools the body efficiently. Sparse body hair helps release that heat. The neck and head are stabilized in ways that aid long-distance locomotion. Scholars still debate how central persistence hunting really is to early human life, and the evidence remains incomplete, but there is broad agreement that humans are unusually good at moving for a very long time. That ability matters even when nobody is running prey to exhaustion. It matters for ranging widely, scouting uncertain terrain following herds, revisiting seasonal resources and linking scattered places into one lived world. A body that can keep going becomes a body that can leave, but anatomy alone explains almost nothing. Many animals migrate over astonishing distances without remaking the planet. What makes humans different is the growing intimacy between body and mind action and memory, individual skill, and collective knowledge. Early Homo sapiens does not simply endure environments, it interprets them. A patch of ground is not just ground. It is where rain collects after a certain wind, where tubers can be dug in lean months, where stone flakes best, where gazelle pass at dawn, where another group camped last wet season, where old people remember there used to be a spring. Humans begin to inhabit not only terrain but patterns. They live inside information. That mental life leaves only indirect traces, yet the traces are hard to ignore. Across parts of Africa by the Middle Stone Age, people are shaping tools with an attention that goes beyond crude necessity. Some points are carefully thinned. Some materials are selected from particular sources and transported over long distances. Ochre appears in contexts that suggest more than purely practical use. At a few sites, engraved pieces and shell beads hint at symbolic behaviour, social display or identity marking, though scholars still debate the meanings involved. No single artifact proves a revolution in thought. What survives in the record suggests something slower and more profound, the steady expansion of a mind able to plan ahead. Remember absent things, imagine alternatives and invest objects with meanings shared by others. That last point may be among the most important. Humans do not merely think, they think together. Cooperation is old in the human line, but in Homo sapiens it becomes increasingly elastic and far-reaching. Food can be shared beyond the immediate act of eating. Childcare can be distributed. A skilled hunter, a careful gatherer, an expert toolmaker, an older person with deep memory of place, a young scout with speed and nerve, none thrives entirely alone. Human groups survive by combining different strengths, and this social flexibility may be every bit as important as any technological advance. A species with distributed intelligence can solve problems no individual could manage. The long human childhood fits into this story with quiet importance. Human children remain dependent for an unusually long time. At first glance, that looks like a weakness. In dangerous landscapes, helpless infants are liabilities. They need carrying, feeding, watching, comforting. Their survival ties adults to one another more tightly, yet the cost creates a hidden advantage. Extended childhood makes room for longer learning. Skills do not need to be instinctive if they can be taught. Knowledge can deepen across generations because there is time to absorb it. Fire use foraging routes, medicinal plants, social rules, tool shaping, hazard recognition, seasonal timing, kinship obligations, and perhaps increasingly complex language all become things a young human can grow into rather than simply inherit as fixed instinct. This is one reason humans are so adaptable. They are not born knowing how to live in a coastline, a grassland, a woodland, or an arid plain. They are born able to learn how their people live there. That sounds obvious, but it has immense consequences. It means the species can enter new settings without waiting for slow genetic change to reshape it every time. Culture begins to do adaptive work. Fire changes food. Clothing changes climate. Containers change transport. Shared stories, whether practical or symbolic, change coordination. The human niche becomes increasingly portable. Language or something close enough to it to serve similar purposes likely sits near the center of this portability, even if its origins remain elusive. Soft tissue leaves no fossils. There is no preserved first conversation. Scholars still debate when language becomes fully modern, whether it arrives gradually or in pulses, and how visible its early effects ought to be in archaeology. Yet it is difficult to imagine the level of cooperation, planning and teaching seen in later human expansion without some highly flexible form of communication. A species able to discuss what is absent gains an extraordinary advantage. It can describe a waterhole beyond the ridge, warn of strangers from the valley, teach how to shape a point before the stone is touched, and tell children where danger lies in places they have never seen. Once speech can carry memory across time and space, the world becomes easier to traverse. The ability to form and maintain larger social networks may also be crucial. Small groups can vanish quickly through bad luck alone. A drought, disease episode, conflict, or run of poor births can erase them. But groups linked to others through mating alliances, exchange, and periodic gathering are more resilient. They can replenish numbers, share knowledge, and reduce the risks of isolation. One lesser known but increasingly important idea in human origins research is that connectivity may matter as much as local innovation. A group that invents a new tool but remains cut off may disappear with it. A group embedded in wider networks can spread useful habits and absorb outside ideas. In that sense, the success of Homo sapiens may depend not just on intelligence but on circulation. This circulation does not make life easy. The daily reality remains harsh. Food security is uncertain. Predators remain lethal. Injury is common. Climate can rearrange familiar territory within a lifetime, or between one generation and the next. Human beings do not become adaptable because conditions are comfortable. They become adaptable because comfort is unreliable. In one period, wetlands provide fish, birds, and reeds for baskets or shelters. In another, the same area dries and turns hostile. A community that survives both states becomes different from one that knows only a single stable niche. It learns to switch diets, alter movement patterns, and reevaluate old assumptions. Over thousands of years, this kind of living would favor a temperament that is observant, opportunistic, and socially attentive. None of this means early humans are uniquely destined from the start to dominate every ecosystem they enter. That view smooths away too much contingency. Other hominins are also intelligent, capable, and well adapted to their own worlds. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other now lost populations are not failed prototypes awaiting replacement. They are real humans in the broad sense of the word with long histories of survival. The rise of Homo sapiens does not happen because all competitors are crude or stagnant. It happens insofar as current evidence suggests because our species combines several useful traits at once: broad diet, social flexibility, portable technology, long-distance networking, symbolic signaling, cumulative learning, and the stubborn capacity to keep adjusting. No single explanation fully accounts for the outcome, but the composite picture is hard to miss. There is also a psychological dimension that archaeology can only partly glimpse. Humans seem unusually capable of projecting themselves into the future. They store food, prepare for seasonal return shape tools for later use, and perhaps imagine places beyond immediate experience. At some point, people cease to live purely inside the present landscape. They begin to carry models of other landscapes in the mind. That capacity may sound abstract, but it changes everything. A coastline can be followed because the next inlet is expected. A dry corridor can be attempted because elders remember wetter times. A mountain pass can be risked because game is known beyond it. Exploration in its earliest form may simply be the extension of remembered possibility. And so the species is prepared not by one breakthrough but by accumulation. The body can travel, the hand can make, the mind can compare, the group can coordinate, the child can learn, The elder can remember, the network can connect, culture can travel faster than genes, and knowledge can outlast the individuals who first discovered it. By the time humans begin to leave Africa in ways that will eventually matter to the whole planet, the essential machinery is already in place. They do not yet command the world, but they carry within them a powerful set of tools for entering worlds that are not their own. For now, though, they are still within Africa, and that matters more than any later triumph. Because the continent that gives rise to Homo sapiens does not simply produce a species, it produces a way of being in motion. It teaches humans to survive uncertainty by becoming flexible, to survive danger by becoming cooperative, and to survive change by making memory social. That is the deeper reason the story does not remain local. A creature shaped in one stable paradise might have stayed there forever. A creature shaped in shifting African worlds is far more likely sooner or later to step into another horizon and keep walking. Africa before the great departures is not a backdrop. It is not a single stage with one climate, one ecology, one people and one direction of movement waiting to be discovered. It is an entire world. To understand why humans eventually leave it, it helps first to understand why they stay so long. For hundreds of thousands of years, Africa offers not one homeland but many coasts washed by rich tides, equatorial forests dense with hidden food and danger, highland zones cooler than the plains below, vast savannas where herds darken the horizon, river systems that bind dry country together, deserts that expand and contract with the sky's long moods. Long before humans learn to live almost everywhere else, they are already learning to live in many Africas. That diversity matters because adaptability is not built in abstraction. It is built in contact with different demands. A group living near a shell-rich coast does not face the same choices as one moving through dry grassland or wooded uplands. Diet changes, risk changes, travel changes. The rhythm of the year changes. Near the coast tide, knowledge matters. In arid zones, water memory becomes everything. In woodland and savanna mosaics, people must read a more complex pattern of cover-prey predators and seasonal plants. Even within a few hundred miles, daily life can differ profoundly. What survives in the record suggests that Homo sapiens is already responding to this variety in flexible ways before any enduring migration beyond the continent takes hold. The old image of Africa as a simple point of origin, almost empty until humans set off to make history elsewhere, has collapsed under the weight of evidence. The continent contains immense population depth, regional variation, and repeated episodes of contact and separation. Fossil stone tools, genetics, and paleo-environmental data increasingly point toward a story that is broad and braided rather than narrow and linear. Scholars still debate the exact structure of these early populations, but many now think modern humans emerge across networks of partially connected groups, spread over large areas, not from one tiny isolated cradle alone. In practical terms, that means human diversity is old. It is present near the beginning, not merely the result of later migration. This wider African story helps explain something that might otherwise seem puzzling. Why does a species capable of movement remain within the continent for so long? One answer is that there is no urgent need to leave a land so abundant in possibility. Africa during favourable periods can contain open corridors, rich fisheries, productive wetlands, game-filled grasslands and seasonal resources spread across linked ecologies. Local movement and regional dispersal may be enough. A people do not need to cross into Southwest Asia to find novelty if the world around them is already dynamic and immense. The human future is global, but the human present inside Africa is already expansive. In some regions, coastlines seem especially important. Sites in southern Africa suggest people are exploiting marine food surprisingly early. Shellfish, fish, seabirds, and coastal plants offer buffers against seasonal scarcity inland. There is still debate over how regular or intensive this use is, and no single site can stand for an entire continent, but the larger pattern is significant. Shorelines are not empty edges. They are rich ecological zones, and they may encourage new habits of scheduling, gathering, and movement. One lesser-known detail is that coastal resources can reward careful timing more than brute force. A shoreline teaches attention to cycles, tide, moon season, weather return. That sort of thinking fits well with a species already growing skilled at planning around patterns. Elsewhere, inland water systems play a similar role. Lakes and rivers are magnets in dry environments, and Africa's changing hydrology repeatedly rearranges where people can live and move. During humid phases, the Sahara does not always function as the immense barrier it later becomes. Parts of it green, filling with lakes, marshes, and grasslands. Animals spread into regions now desolate. Human groups can travel through corridors that later vanish almost completely. Then the pendulum swings back. Wetlands retreat. Grassland hardens into desert. Routes narrow or close. These cycles do not merely alter scenery. They sort populations, connect them, isolate them, and reconnect them again. The evidence remains incomplete, but climate-driven opening and closing of habitable zones is increasingly seen as one of the engines of early human diversity within Africa itself. The Sahara is especially revealing because it reminds us how unstable familiar maps really are. Today it appears as one of the world's great obstacles, a continental divide of heat and aridity. Yet in earlier phases it is at times a lived landscape, with waterways, animals and human occupation. Rock art from much later humid periods preserves vivid hints of this greener Sahara, with cattle wildlife, and people inhabiting what is now barren sand and stone. Those images come from a later chapter, but they help modern eyes grasp a larger truth. Regions that seem permanently hostile are often only temporarily so. The same holds for routes out of Africa. A corridor that is impossible in one era may be open in another. Geography alone does not decide the story. Geography plus climate does. Within these African worlds, people are not simply surviving as generic hunter-gatherers. They are building local expertise. This may be one of the most important foundations for later expansion. To live successfully across the continent, groups must become specialists in different combinations of knowledge. They learn which routes store water, which stone travels best, which animals move before rain, which grasses seed at the edge of drought, which insects can be eaten, which trees mark hidden moisture, which plants soothe wounds or poison spear points. Such knowledge is intimate and difficult to recover from archaeology, but it is the fabric of prehistoric life. Global migration later depends not on abstract intelligence, but on this practical tradition of turning unfamiliar ground into usable ground. That's why Africa before departure is so essential. It is rehearsal not because it is lesser than the world beyond, but because it already contains many of the problems the wider world will pose in more extreme form. Here humans learn to shift between ecologies. Here they learn that one strategy will not fit every season or every place. Here they learn, too, the social consequences of mobility. Moving through large varied landscapes requires relationships, alliances for mating, exchange of materials, hospitality, or tolerated passage memory of rival groups, rules of distance and approach. Even conflict can shape adaptability by forcing innovation in movement and signaling. The future global species is being socialized in continental complexity. Genetics adds another layer to this picture, though the signals are difficult to interpret cleanly. African populations today contain the deepest known human genetic diversity, which makes sense if the species spends most of its time there before later dispersals carry only portions of that diversity outward. But the deeper lesson is not just that Africa is older in genetic terms, it is that multiple lineages and subpopulations likely exist within it for long periods, sometimes diverging, sometimes reconnecting. No single explanation fully accounts for every genetic pattern, and ancient DNA from tropical Africa remains frustratingly scarce because heat and humidity destroy it so efficiently. Still, what survives in the record suggests a long history of structure within Africa, not one stream but many channels feeding and rejoining. This has consequences for how we imagine early humanity. It means innovation may arise in one region and spread to others. It means physical traits do not change everywhere at once. It means cultural habits may be local, shared, lost, revived, or reinvented. It also means that when humans eventually leave Africa successfully, they do not represent the entire continent in equal measure. They are some subset of its diversity shaped by particular routes, bottlenecks, and chance events. The global human story, for all its scale, may begin with only a thin sampling of Africa's much larger human world. There is also a quieter point here, one often overshadowed by the drama of later expansion. Africa is not merely the beginning of human history. For most of human history, it is the centre of it. While Eurasia, Australia, and the Americas remain unoccupied by modern humans, Africa already contains long experimentation in survival technology, symbolism, and social life. The habit of treating prehistory as a waiting room before humans become fully themselves elsewhere is deeply misleading. The record inside Africa shows no such emptiness. It shows depth invention and prolonged adaptation on a continental scale. One surprising clue to this depth lies in tool traditions that fade and reappear in different places at different times. Archaeology once loved clean ladders of progress, with each technique replacing the last in orderly ascent. The reality appears much less tidy. Some sophisticated behaviours emerge early in one area and are absent in another. Some techniques disappear and later return. Some regions maintain durable local traditions. That unevenness is not a sign of failure. It may reflect shifting population densities, interrupted contact, local ecological needs, and the fragility of cultural transmission in small groups. The same species can look very different from place to place without ceasing to be the same species. All of this complicates the idea of a single cause for departure. Humans do not wake one morning and decide to leave Africa as if it were one crowded room. They live in particular regions under particular conditions. One area dries, another becomes favourable, one network expands, another fragments, one coastline supports movement, another is cut off by distance or hostility. Any eventual outward dispersal is therefore built from local stories nested inside a continental story. To understand why humans leave, one must first understand how thoroughly they belong, and belonging runs deep. The smells, plants, stars, migrations, dangers, and opportunities of Africa shape human perception. The predators there train caution, the distances train endurance, the diversity trains flexibility, the climate swings train memory and opportunism, the social landscape trains negotiation and exchange. By the time some populations reach the continent's edges and move beyond them, they're not escaping a primitive childhood. They're carrying the products of a long and complex African maturity. That is what makes the later expansion so remarkable. The people who leave are not wandering away from simplicity into greatness. They're emerging from a continent already vast enough to teach them almost everything, except the exact form of the world still ahead. Forests thicker than anything they know, winters colder than any their ancestors have endured, coasts stretching eastward for thousands of miles, mountain chains, steppe island arcs inland, ice, giant, unfamiliar beasts and other human species waiting beyond the horizon, all of that will come later. But the essential groundwork has already been laid in Africa itself. Before humans become citizens of the planet, they become students of a continent large and varied enough to prepare them for one. Then the sky changes, and with it everything else. Rain that once returned with tolerable rhythm begins to hesitate. Grasslands shrink, then flare back into life. Lakes deepen, overflow, retreat, and sometimes vanish. Rivers that have guided animals and people across familiar country become unreliable threads. Coastlines advance and withdraw, with the slow breathing of ice ages far to the north. In a human lifetime, these shifts may feel like a run of difficult seasons, a bad stretch, a remembered time when the elders say the marsh stood higher, or the herds came earlier. Across millennia, they become the hidden machinery of migration. Climate does not command human beings like a puppeteer, but it keeps rearranging the board on which every decision must be made. This is one of the great corrections to older ways of telling the story. Humans do not simply leave Africa because they become clever enough. They leave when they do through windows opened and closed by environment. That does not make them passive. It means intelligence works in partnership with opportunity. A route can exist on a map and remain useless for thousands of years. Then a shift in rainfall turns barren ground into grassland, opens chains of fresh water, and transforms a dead end into a corridor. Just as quickly, the same corridor can close again. Scholars still debate the precise timing and relative importance of these openings, but no serious account of human dispersal can avoid the climate at its centre. Africa's climates during the late Middle Pleistocene and into the late Pleistocene are restless in a way that is hard to grasp from the steadier rhythms of recent history. The continent is tied to global glacial cycles, changes in Earth's orbit, monsoon intensity, sea levels, and regional feedbacks involving vegetation and dust. These are slow forces by human standards, yet their outcomes can be dramatic. A stronger African monsoon pushes rain northward, greening parts of the Sahara and Arabian fringe. Weaker monsoons pull the lifebelt back, letting desert reassert itself. The evidence comes from lake sediments, fossil pollen cave formations, ancient shorelines, marine cores, and other indirect archives that scholars piece together with painstaking care. The record is never perfect. Dates can be debated. Regional patterns do not always align neatly. But what survives in the record suggests repeated pulses of habitability, where today many people imagine only permanent barriers. The Green Sahara is among the most arresting examples. It sounds almost mythical now, but during humid phases, large parts of North Africa become traversable landscapes of lakes, grasslands, wetlands, and animal life. Hippos wallow in waters where only sand lies now. Herds spread across what later becomes hostile emptiness. Human beings occupy spaces that modern intuition would dismiss at once. This matters not just because it broadens Africa internally, but because it changes the continent's relationship to the lands beyond. North Africa is no longer sealed off in the same way. The Sinai and northeastern corridors become more plausible. So do routes toward the Arabian Peninsula when conditions align. Sea level is another quiet force with outsized consequences. When global ice volume rises, sea levels fall, exposing broader coastal plains and sometimes narrowing marine crossings. When ice retreats, water climbs, drowning old shorelines and erasing evidence under the sea. This is one reason the story remains so difficult to reconstruct. Some of the most important routes humans may have used now lie underwater. If early populations followed coasts' harvested tidal margins, and moved along now submerged shelves, much of their trail is hidden from us. The evidence remains incomplete, not because nothing happened there, but because later oceans have swallowed the archive. Along the northeastern edge of Africa and into Arabia, climate can act like a gatekeeper. At certain times, the route out seems forbidding harsh desert stretches, poor water access, ecological bottlenecks. At other times, the same general zone becomes threaded with grass lakes and river systems, enough to support animals and the people who follow them. Arabia itself is often imagined as an eternal wasteland, but paleoclimate research has changed that picture profoundly. Ancient lakes, river channels, and wetter intervals point to repeated habitable phases. One lesser-known detail is how quickly a region's character can shift once rainfall crosses a threshold. A landscape that looks impassable in one climate state can become a mosaic of viable camps, hunting grounds, and passageways in another. Yet climate alone does not produce migration. It creates possibilities, not outcomes. A greener corridor does not march people through it. Populations must exist near its entrance. They must be numerous enough, connected enough, or pressured enough to exploit it. They must know how to move across uncertain ground, how to read new resources, how to maintain cooperation under stress. And even then, many attempts may fail. A short wet phase may end too soon. A small pioneering group may die out. A route may open toward lands already occupied by other human populations. To say climate turns the key is not to say it writes the story by itself. It means the door is sometimes unlocked. Within Africa, these environmental oscillations likely do more than shape routes outward. They also shape people themselves. Populations expand in favourable periods and contract in difficult ones. Groups once connected become isolated by drying belts. Others reconnect when grasslands return. Innovation may spread widely during dense linked phases and falter when populations thin out. Some archaeologists argue that bursts of symbolic behaviour or technological complexity may correlate partly with times of stronger connectivity. Others caution that the pattern is still too patchy to state so confidently. No single explanation fully accounts for the archaeological record. Still, there is a compelling logic in the idea that climate not only influences where humans can go, but how socially and culturally robust they are when the moment to go arrives. There is something almost paradoxical here. The same instability that makes life harder may also prepare humans to range farther. A species shaped in highly stable conditions might become exquisitely specialized and reluctant to move. A species repeatedly forced to cope with unpredictability may become more exploratory, more opportunistic, more willing to treat the unfamiliar as survivable. This does not mean ancient humans are romantic adventurers wandering toward the horizon for its own sake. It means their normal existence already includes recalibration. A water source fails, another must be found. A herd shifts route, a camp moves, a marsh dries, diets change. Over thousands of generations, mobility becomes not an exceptional act, but a recurrent solution. The climate story also helps explain why there is no single clean exodus date. Popular retellings often want one dramatic departure, one chosen moment when humanity leaves Africa and begins its global career. The real pattern appears far messier. There are likely multiple dispersals, some early, some later, some successful in the long run, some ending without lasting descendants beyond the region. Different routes may open at different times. Different populations may respond in different ways. The old desire for a singular beginning gives way to something more complicated and more human repeated testing of ecological thresholds under changing skies. Even inside one region, the consequences of climate can be subtle. Rainfall does not only alter vegetation, it changes the movement of prey species, The burden of disease, the availability of wood for fires, the reliability of wetlands where birds and fish can supplement diet, and the spacing between places where people can safely camp. It also affects how far neighbouring groups are from one another and whether contact becomes easier or more dangerous. In a greener world, movement can expand. In a harsher one, people may cluster around shrinking refuges, intensifying both competition and exchange. The human landscape becomes more compressed or more open, according to the mood of the climate. What makes this especially haunting is how little of it would be obvious in the moment. Nobody standing beside a receding lake says they are witnessing the precondition for a future migration into Eurasia. They see thirst, uncertainty, perhaps opportunity. A chain of wet years may encourage movement into lands not visited for generations. A sequence of dry years may trap people or propel them elsewhere. Children grow up in one landscape and age into another. Oral memory, if it reaches far enough, becomes one of the few tools for judging whether strange country ahead has once been livable. The future of the species may hinge on what some old person remembers about rain, and so climate becomes less like scenery and more like an invisible architect. It shapes the breadth of grasslands, the edges of forests, the placement of rivers, the health of coastlines, the thickness of deserts, the distance between refuges, the possibility of corridors, the survival of game, and the scale of human networks. It determines whether Africa feels at a given time like a continent of internal abundance, or a place where some margins begin to point outward. It does not tell people where to go, but it decides which directions are even imaginable. By the time some groups stand near the northeastern exits of Africa, or along the coastlines that may one day carry them farther, the decisive condition is not simply human capability. It is timing. The species is ready in a broad sense long before the world is ready to receive it. Routes must align with weather-water coast prey and population circumstance. When they do, movement becomes possible. When they do not, the same ambition collapses into retreat or death. That is why so many outward attempts may have been temporary. The key turns, but only for a while. Soon enough, some of those doors will open just wide enough for humans to step beyond the continent and test a new world. But before any lasting expansion, there are threshold crossings that do not hold footholds gained and lost presences that flicker at Africa's edge and disappear again. The climate makes those attempts possible, and then just as often it seems to erase them. The first steps outward are therefore not triumphs but experiments made under skies that never stop changing. When humans first move beyond Africa, the crossing does not look like the beginning of world history. It looks small, precarious, and easy to miss. A band follows game into greener country. Another hugs a line of water and reeds. Some groups may move north through the Nile corridor and the Sinai, others, perhaps across the southern gate near the Bab el-Mandeb when sea levels are lower and the crossing narrower, though scholars still debate how often that route is used this early and under what exact conditions. However it happens, the first steps beyond the continent are not a flood. They are a testing of edges. A few valleys, a few wetlands, a few generations of trying to live in lands that are close to Africa, on a map, but already different in consequence. The Levant becomes one of the first important thresholds. It is neither fully Africa nor fully the deep interior of Eurasia. It is a hinge zone, a place where climate, species, and human populations meet and overlap. In favourable periods, it can be rich with grassland, woodland, game, and water, but it is also exposed to the same long instability that shapes the wider region. For humans coming out of Africa, this is the first true frontier that matters in the archaeological record. It is reachable, livable for a time, and yet difficult to hold. That difficulty is one of the most revealing parts of the story. Leaving Africa turns out not to be the hard part. Staying out may be harder. There are signs that humans reach the Levant far earlier than the later Great Expansion that will eventually populate most of the globe. Fossils from sites such as Skul and Kafse in what is now Israel suggest anatomically modern humans are present there roughly 100,000 years ago, perhaps a little earlier or later depending on the dating framework used. They bury their dead. They make tools. They live at least for stretches of time in a region that lies outside Africa, yet still within a familiar ecological band compared with the harsher north. These people matter enormously because they show that Homo sapiens can leave the continent long before the dispersal that leads to most later non-African populations. In other words, early success is possible. Permanent success is another matter. The world these first outward migrants enter is not empty. That point changes everything. The Levant is a meeting ground not only of habitats, but of humans in the broader sense. Neanderthals move through this same region during colder phases, and perhaps in alternating occupation with modern humans depending on climate. What this contact looks like on the ground remains uncertain. At times, the two populations may replace one another in the same broad territory as conditions shift. At other times, they may overlap more directly. The evidence remains incomplete, and the chronology is still debated in places, but what survives in the record suggests the corridor out of Africa is not a vacant road. It is contested, ecologically sensitive, and periodically shared. That ecological sensitivity matters because the Levant only works as a bridge under certain conditions. In wetter intervals, it offers productive habitats linking Africa with Southwest Asia. In drier or colder phases, it becomes more difficult, more fragmented, less forgiving. A human group may establish itself there for generations, perhaps even flourish, and still disappear when climate turns or competition intensifies. This is one reason the earliest excursions beyond Africa seem so fragile. They do not yet have the momentum numbers or perhaps the favourable conditions required to push much farther or endure repeated environmental reversal. They arrive in a threshold zone, and then often the threshold closes. One lesser-known detail sharpens the picture. Archaeological presence can mean many things. A few campsites, a burial, a scatter of tools, or a handful of fossils may represent repeated seasonal visits, a brief occupation over several centuries, or a longer but thinly distributed population. The traces are rarely enough to reconstruct demographic strength with confidence. So when we say humans reach the Levant early, we do not necessarily mean they pour into it in great numbers. It may be more accurate to imagine scattered populations testing a broad margin, advancing, thinning out, retreating, and sometimes disappearing without leaving many descendants. History later remembers global takeover. Prehistory at this stage looks more like a series of vulnerable footholds. The people making these early moves are not less human than those who come later. They possess many of the same essential capacities social cooperation planning tool use ecological intelligence. But timing matters, and scale matters. A small population entering new terrain can be undone by bad luck alone. A few harsh seasons, disease conflict with neighbouring groups, low birth rates or broken exchange networks can erase a settlement pattern that once seemed promising. Human expansion is not guaranteed by ability. It depends on the ability being matched with conditions that let numbers hold and knowledge circulate. What would this first outward world feel like? The answer is necessarily inferred, but the outlines are vivid enough. For groups moving through the Levant, the landscape would offer familiar and unfamiliar things in the same glance. There are herd animals, watercourses, grasses, wooded patches, rocky shelters. But the rhythm of the seasons may differ. The competitors may differ. The winter cold may reach harder. The routes that seem open one year may fail in another. People carry remembered strategies from Africa, yet must alter them in practice. They are close enough to home for resemblance, far enough for consequences. In these early expansions, fire likely matters more than ever. So does shelter clothing and the careful choice of camp locations. Toolkits suited to African ecologies may need adjustment for prey behavior, local materials and seasonal stress. Knowledge can no longer rely only on inherited familiarity. It must become more experimental. That may be one reason threshold zones are so informative. They reveal not just that humans can move, but how much strain movement places on social life. A group entering new land must keep children fed, maintain trust, remember roots back, negotiate contact with outsiders, and decide when persistence becomes too costly. Migration in deep prehistory is not a heroic line on a map. It is a chain of risk calculations made by people whose margin for error is very small. The Levantine evidence also undermines any simple story in which one triumphant exit leads directly to world domination. These early populations outside Africa do not obviously found the main line of later expansion. Genetic evidence from living people strongly suggests that the large majority of ancestry in present-day populations outside Africa traces back to a later dispersal, likely around 60 to 70,000 years ago, rather than these earlier excursions. That means the first steps beyond Africa, remarkable as they are, may be largely evolutionary dead ends in demographic terms. Their legacy is archaeological rather than genealogical. They prove the door can be opened. They do not yet walk through it for good. That possibility gives the whole story a more haunting shape. Humanity reaches outward, touches another continent, and then perhaps slips back or is overtaken. The first exit is not a permanent escape, but a flicker. Some local populations may persist for a time, but the broader expansion stalls. Climate may close corridors, Neanderthals may reoccupy parts of the same zone. African source populations may fragment or redirect. No single explanation fully accounts for why these early movements failed to become the decisive dispersal. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the balance between environmental reversal, demographic weakness, and competition. But the larger point is clear enough. The species capable of taking over the world spends a long time not doing so, and perhaps that is exactly what we should expect. Evolution does not move in sweeping cinematic arcs. It proceeds by hesitation, trial loss, and repetition. If a route out of Africa opens once humans may try it, if it opens again thousands of years later under better conditions, they may try it differently. Each attempt leaves behind fragments, stone points, bones, burials, altered sediments, traces of fire. Those fragments tell us that the threshold is being tested long before it is mastered. Humans do not burst into Eurasia fully unstoppable. They lean against the boundary first. They learn its weather, its risks, and its limits. There is also something quietly important in the fact that these first outward steps go into a region of overlap, rather than into some vast unoccupied void. From the start, leaving Africa means entering a world already inhabited by other intelligent humans. That fact will matter more and more as the story unfolds. The future of Homo sapiens is not simply a matter of adapting to climate and landscape. It is also a matter of living among kin species who know these lands already. In the Levant that reality first becomes unmistakable. Africa is behind but not far behind. Eurasia is ahead but not yet open. So the first steps beyond Africa are both bold and fragile. They show that the species can cross ecological thresholds, occupy new terrain, and endure outside its home continent for meaningful spans of time. They also show how easily that presence can dissolve. The doorway out exists, but it is narrow, temporary, and difficult to hold. Humans stand in it, then sometimes vanish from it. The record preserves enough to prove they were there, not enough to make their experience feel secure. For long ages, the world beyond Africa is touched only lightly. The real exodus has not yet begun. What has begun is something subtler, the discovery that departure is possible, and the equally important discovery that possibility alone is not enough. The earliest roads out of Africa do not become highways. They appear, they invite passage, and then they seem to swallow the people who try them. This is one of the strangest parts of the human story. If modern humans reach the Levant more than 100,000 years ago, and perhaps probe other margins of Southwest Asia at various moments after that, why does the world remain largely unconquered by them for so long? Why do these first exits leave so little obvious legacy in later populations? The answer, as usual, refuses to be simple. The first migrations beyond Africa may not fail for one reason, but for many interacting in ways the record can only partly recover. Some of these failed exits may not be visible to us at all. Archaeology preserves accidents, not total histories. A group can live in a region for centuries and leave only a faint scatter of stone, a few butchered bones, perhaps nothing that survives later erosion or burial. If populations move along coastlines now drowned by higher seas, the trail is even harder to detect. The evidence remains incomplete, and what is absent from the record should not be mistaken for what never happened. It is entirely possible that many human ventures beyond Africa flicker in and out of existence, without leaving fossils dramatic enough to anchor them in popular imagination. In that sense, disappearance may be the default condition of early migration. Demography is part of the problem. Small populations are fragile even in familiar landscapes. In new ones, they become precarious to the point of vanishing. A few bad years can matter enormously. A failed hunt matters more when food-sharing networks are thin. An epidemic matters more when numbers are already low. A string of difficult births can break continuity. Injuries can remove skilled adults who carry crucial knowledge. Contact with other groups can bring conflict or at the very least competition over the best water shelter and prey routes. To step beyond Africa early may be possible, but to maintain a self-sustaining population beyond it requires density resilience and repeated reinforcement. Many pioneering groups may simply never reach that threshold. This is one reason archaeologists increasingly distinguish between presence and persistence. Presence means humans were there. Persistence means they stayed in enough numbers over long enough spans to keep local knowledge alive, reproduce, and perhaps expand. The first may happen several times. The second seems much harder. A camp is easy to imagine. A lineage that survives climatic reversal and ecological stress is harder. A migration only becomes historically decisive when it crosses that invisible line from temporary occupation to durable establishment. Climate once again likely turns against many early ventures. The Levant and surrounding regions are ecological hinges highly sensitive to shifting moisture, temperature, and vegetation. A corridor that seems workable during a humid phase can close with brutal speed as rainfall retreats. Water becomes patchier. Herds change routes or decline. Plant foods become less reliable. Habitats that once linked Africa to Southwest Asia fragment into disconnected patches of survival. Human groups caught in those patches may retreat, die out, or become absorbed into other populations. Scholars still debate how abrupt some of these transitions are on the ground, but the larger pattern is clear. The same climate system that occasionally opens the gate can just as easily lock it again. There is also the problem of familiarity. Early Homo sapiens entering lands beyond Africa are adaptable, but they are not omniscient. Every new habitat must be learned in detail. Which animals are dangerous in a new way? Which seasonal signals matter here? Which plants nourish, poison, or heal? Where does water persist through the dry phase? Where do cold winds cut hardest? A group can carry broad cognitive tools from Africa, but not the specific knowledge needed for every foreign ecology. That knowledge must be built locally, often through mistakes. In threshold zones, mistakes can be fatal. One lesser-known truth about migration is that survival depends less on movement itself than on learning quickly enough after movement. And then there are the other humans. This is where failed exits become especially interesting. Neanderthals are not passive scenery waiting to be replaced. They are long-established inhabitants of Western Eurasia, deeply adapted to the climates and prey of those lands. They understand the terrain in ways newcomers do not. They know migration routes, shelter patterns, hunting opportunities and seasonal hazards accumulated over countless generations. It would be surprising if early modern humans entering this world did not feel that asymmetry. Whether direct conflict is common occasional or relatively limited competition does not need to take the form of constant violence to be consequential. Simply being the less established population in a marginal and unstable region may be enough to lose ground when conditions deteriorate. This may help explain why some early expansions seem to stop in the Levant rather than burst onward. The region is not just a bridge, it is a filter. Climatic conditions narrow who can use it and when. Existing hominin populations complicate settlement. Demographic fragility punishes overreach. If the African source populations behind these pioneers are themselves shifting or fragmented, there may be no steady stream of support to reinforce an outlying community. A few generations of marginal survival can end quietly with camps abandoned and trails forgotten. Later humans may pass through the same valleys with no idea that others of their kind had once tried and vanished there before. The phrase vanished trails is not merely poetic. In some cases, what disappears is not only the people but the route itself. Coastlines drown, lake systems dry, green belts turn to desert. Migration corridors cease to be corridors in any meaningful sense. Modern maps then mislead us. We ask why humans did not simply continue east or north along a route that looks obvious now, forgetting that the ancient landscape under their feet was different and often less stable. A trail is only a trail while water vegetation prey, and social tolerance make it one. Once those conditions collapse, the same direction becomes a trap. Genetics sharpens the mystery by showing what does not survive. Present-day populations outside Africa derive most of their ancestry from later dispersals, not from the earliest known modern human occupations in the Levant. That does not prove those earlier people leave no descendants at all, but it strongly suggests their long-term demographic impact is minimal compared with later expansions. In effect, some of the first humans to leave Africa may stand at the edge of history without entering its surviving bloodlines in a major way. They are pioneers whose deepest legacy is proof of possibility, not continuity. There is something sobering in that. We tend to remember only successful migrations, only the movements that flower into continents filled with descendants. But the prehistoric world is likely full of movements that go nowhere in the long run. Bands split, drift outward and disappear. Families establish themselves in promising country, and then are erased by drought, disease, predation, low fertility, or absorption into neighbouring populations. No memorial marks these endings. A few artefacts survive, if that. The rest dissolves into sediments and silence. The human past is therefore not a clean march outward, but a graveyard of attempts, many of them unrecoverable. At the same time, failed exits are not wasted chapters. Each one reveals something about the limits and capacities of the species. Early dispersals show that humans can leave Africa under the right conditions. They can establish themselves outside it, at least temporarily. They can occupy ecotones, bury their dead, hunt, gather and adapt in unfamiliar regions. But these same attempts reveal how much more is needed for a lasting exodus. Larger or more connected source populations, more favourable climate windows, technologies and habits, suited to varied terrain, and perhaps a level of social resilience not always available yet. Failure becomes preparation, even if no one living through it would call it that. The archaeological record hints at this uneven rehearsal. Different tool traditions appear in different places and times. Some seem to spread, others remain local. Some episodes of outward movement may involve one technological pattern, later ones another. This does not necessarily mean a simple ladder of improvement. More likely it reflects fluctuating populations, interrupted connections, and changing ecological demands. Scholars still debate how much behaviour changes between early and later dispersals, but it is plausible that the successful expansions draw on a broader package of mobility, networking, and adaptation than some earlier ventures can sustain. There is another possibility too quieter but compelling. The first failed exits may teach the species nothing in a direct cultural sense. If those populations vanish, yet they teach evolution something through selection and population structure. Groups that survive instability in Africa while others disappear beyond its edges continue to shape the species' future. The human line that ultimately expands successfully may therefore be drawn not just from those bold enough to leave, but from those robust enough to persist amid repeated cycles of opening and collapse. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and the record cannot show such sorting neatly. Still, it fits the deeper pattern of a species tested again and again by environmental uncertainty. So the world beyond Africa is approached, entered, and lost more than once. Humans stand in the doorway, retreat from it, return to it, and sometimes leave only the faintest print that they were ever there. These vanished trails matter because they strip away the illusion of inevitability. There is no smooth, predestined expansion, no uninterrupted rise toward global dominance. There are opportunities, missed opportunities cut short, and opportunities grasped too early to last. The species that will one day fill every habitable continent spends a long time discovering how easy it is to disappear, and then after enough failed footholds and closed corridors, conditions shift again. The gates do not merely crack open for a season. Something larger begins to gather populations within Africa, roots across Arabia, or the northeast habits of mobility strong enough to hold together perhaps climate windows wide enough to support sustained movement rather than brief presence. The difference at first may not be obvious. Another small group sets out. Another frontier is tested. But this time the trail does not vanish so easily. This time the movement continues. At first it may not look different from the earlier attempts. A few families shift outward along a corridor made passable by rain. A small population follows coastlines or interior grasslands into Arabia. Camps are made abandoned, made again. Children are born on ground their grandparents never knew. The difference is not visible in a single step. It is visible only in what happens next. This time the movement does not fade at the edge of Africa or stall in the Levant and disappear. This time it keeps travelling through generations, through connected habitats, through bottlenecks and open stretches until what began as one more dispersal becomes the beginning of a planetary one. Most lines of evidence now point to a major and ultimately successful expansion of Homo sapiens out of Africa, sometime around 60 to 70,000 years ago, though the exact timing routes and structure remain debated. Genetics has been especially influential here. The ancestry of present-day populations outside Africa appears to derive largely from a subset of African humans who leave during this later window rather than from the much earlier known occupations in the Levant. That does not erase the earlier pioneers, but it places the decisive demographic event later. In broad terms, this is the dispersal that matters most for the peopling of Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas. Why this movement succeeds where others do not is one of the central mysteries of prehistory. No single explanation fully accounts for it. Climate likely helps by opening viable routes across northern Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, or both. Sea levels may make certain coastal passages more manageable. Population pressures within parts of Africa may encourage outward drift. Social networks may be strong enough to support longer chains of movement and reduce the risks of isolation. Toolkits and habits of adaptation may also be more robust or more portable than in some earlier phases. The answer is probably not one cause, but a convergence enough. People, enough knowledge, enough favourable timing, and enough ecological opportunity arriving together. Arabia seems increasingly important in this chapter. For a long time it was treated as little more than a barren transit zone, a difficult bridge between Africa and the richer worlds farther east. Recent archaeology and paleoclimate research have changed that view. During wetter periods, Arabia contains lakes, river systems, grasslands, and animals that make human occupation plausible in many areas. Stone tools, fossil evidence, and ancient lake margins all suggest that human populations pass through or dwell within this region more often than older models allowed. This does not mean the journey is easy. It means that what looks inhospitable now may once have offered a chain of temporary worlds enough to support gradual expansion rather than a single desperate leap. Whether the main successful route runs primarily through the Sinai and the Levant across the Bab el-Mandeb into Arabia, or through some combination of inland and coastal pathways remains actively debated. Different lines of evidence support different emphases. Genetics often suggests a severe bottleneck consistent with a relatively small founding population. Archaeology reveals multiple potential corridors. Paleo-environmental data show habitability shifting across both northern and southern routes at different times. Scholars still debate how tightly one should link the genetic story to any single archaeological track. The evidence remains incomplete, and some of the most critical landscapes now lie underwater or buried beneath later sediments. Still, the broad pattern is unmistakable by this later period. Humans begin moving beyond Africa in a way that continues instead of collapsing. One lesser-known aspect of this expansion is how uneven it may look on the ground. The Great Expansion sounds like a surge, but prehistoric movement likely happens in pulses. A group pushes into a new zone and lingers there for generations. Another splits and follows game or water farther on. Others remain behind. Some branches may fail even now. The overall pattern moves outward, but not as a smooth wave. It is a mosaic of pauses and advances of local adaptation nested inside a larger continental dispersal. Seen from far away, it resembles a spreading species. Seen from within, it would feel like many small decisions repeated and inherited. This successful dispersal also seems to carry a species already practiced in flexibility. By this stage, Homo sapiens is not just good at surviving one habitat. It is increasingly good at treating new habitats as solvable. A shoreline can be read for food and movement. An inland plain can be scanned for herd paths and seasonal water. A drier environment can be crossed if resource nodes are known well enough. The species is not invincible, but it is mobile in a deeper sense than simple walking. It carries with it systems of learning, sharing, and adjustment that make a new landscape less opaque than it would have been for its ancestors. Population size may be crucial here. A larger or more interconnected population can absorb losses that would destroy a smaller pioneering group. It can send out repeated branches, maintain exchange over distance, and prevent local innovations from dying with isolated individuals. If one band disappears, another may still follow the same route later. If one region turns harsh, linked groups elsewhere can preserve cultural knowledge that may return when conditions improve. This is one reason sociality matters so much in human dispersal. The successful expansion is not just an event of movement, it is an event of continuity. The trail remains alive because enough people keep walking some version of it. There is also the possibility that environmental stress within Africa itself becomes sharper in certain regions, making outward movement more likely. Drying episodes, fluctuating resources, and demographic crowding around refuges could all contribute. Yet it would be misleading to imagine a single push from behind. Africa remains vast and diverse. Some populations almost certainly stay where they are. Others may shift regionally rather than leave the continent altogether. The successful exodus probably begins not as a mass departure, but as one set of connected populations among many taking advantage of circumstances that happen to favour outward range extension. The people who leave are not humanity in full. They are one thread from a much larger African tapestry. As they move beyond the edges that defeated earlier pioneers, something subtle changes. Space begins to accumulate. Distance is no longer merely from one valley to the next or from one wet season camp to another. Distance becomes inheritable. Children are born far from ancestral homelands and their grandchildren farther still. Memory stretches. Stories adjust. The known world expands in ways no single person can encompass. What began as a local movement becomes a lineage of movement. This may be one of the defining psychological shifts of the expansion, though archaeology can glimpse it only indirectly. Humans cease to be a species whose range is centered in one continent and begin to act generation by generation like a species whose home can be rebuilt elsewhere. The encounter with other hominins also becomes more significant now. As Homo sapiens spreads through Southwest Asia, and beyond it moves into territories inhabited by Neanderthals and Denisovans. Unlike the earliest exits, which may falter in threshold zones, this later expansion has the scale and persistence to keep entering new regions, even when those regions are already occupied. The result will not be simple replacement. There will be contact exchange of genes, perhaps exchange of knowledge, and eventually disappearance of the other populations. But at this moment none of that is settled. What matters first is that modern humans are no longer just appearing at the boundary and fading out. They are staying in the game long enough to reshape it. The archaeological footprint begins to widen accordingly. Tool traditions associated with Homo sapiens appear across broader swathes of territory. Occupation traces extend farther east. Genetic evidence implies branching lineages outside Africa. Australia will soon be reached astonishingly early, which means movement through southern Asia must already be underway. All of this suggests a dispersal with real momentum. Not speed in the modern sense, but continuity over enough centuries and millennia to turn repeated movement into continental occupation, and yet inevitability still does not exist. Even this great expansion may include dead branches, isolated losses, false leads, and local extinctions. Some groups likely vanish along the way. Some roots close behind them. Others may contribute little to later ancestry. Success in prehistory is rarely pure. It is ragged, cumulative, and full of hidden failures. What changes now is not that failure disappears, but that it no longer halts the whole process. The species has somehow reached a threshold of resilience where local setbacks do not erase the larger outward pattern. That threshold may be the real turning point of the human story. Once enough populations are established beyond Africa, each new generation grows up not at the edge of the old world, but within the beginnings of a new one. Expansion feeds on itself. More territory means more habitats learned, more routes remembered, more local expertise accumulated, more opportunities for branching movement. The Great Dispersal becomes not one migration, but a long chain of migrations linked by descent and adaptation. So this is the moment when the old pattern breaks. For tens of thousands of years, humans test the margins and often disappear. Then sometime in this later window, one expanding set of populations keeps going. Across Arabia, through the Levant, along southern Asia, perhaps by coasts, perhaps through interior corridors, likely by more than one path at different times, humans begin the movement that will eventually touch every habitable continent. The trail no longer vanishes in the sand. It lengthens, it forks, it survives. And because it survives, the planet itself is about to become the stage of human history. The map that matters now is not made of borders, but of edges, where land meets water, where river mouths open into estuaries, where seasonal rains return just often enough to keep movement possible. If the later successful expansion out of Africa gains its first real momentum somewhere in Arabia and beyond, then coastlines and shifting ecological margins may be among its most important guides. Not because early humans are sailors in any grand sense, and not because every scholar agrees on a single southern route, but because shorelines, river valleys, and seasonal corridors offer something rare in unfamiliar lands' predictable structure. In a world without maps, a coast is a kind of memory line. It tells people where one side of uncertainty ends. The idea that humans may have dispersed rapidly along the coasts of Arabia, South Asia, and farther east has attracted enormous attention for good reason. Coastal zones can supply diverse foods even when inland environments fluctuate. Shellfish fish, seabirds, turtle eggs, edible plants and stranded marine mammals can buffer lean periods. Freshwater sources often cluster where wadies rivers or seasonal streams meet the sea, and a coast unlike open desert or trackless interior offers orientation. Keep land on one side and water on the other, and movement becomes easier to sustain across generations. Yet the evidence remains incomplete. Sea level rise has drowned many ancient shorelines, meaning that some of the most revealing sites may now lie far offshore. Scholars still debate whether coast-hugging dispersal is the main engine of expansion or one route among several. What survives in the record suggests it is at least part of the story. Arabia during wetter windows is not merely a barren stepping stone. It contains lakes, grasslands, and river systems that make occupation plausible in repeated pulses. A people moving through this region may not cling continuously to the water's edge. They may alternate between coasts and interior zones according to season rainfall, game movement, and local knowledge. That is one reason sharp route labels can mislead. Coastal route sounds clean and narrow. Real prehistoric movement is more flexible. Humans likely exploit mosaics, a marine-rich shoreline for one stretch and inland drainage for another, a greener corridor after monsoon rains, then a return to the littoral when the interior dries. This kind of movement requires a particular sort of intelligence, not abstract brilliance, but patient ecological reading. The people spreading eastward do not need to know where India, Southeast Asia or Australia are. They need to know where today's water lies, where shell beds renew, when fish gather in the shallows, where dangerous stretches can be crossed and when inland opportunities justify leaving the shore for a time. Seasonal knowledge becomes route knowledge. A path is not a fixed line. It is a timing problem. One lesser-known detail makes this even more intriguing. Coastal environments are often nutritionally rich in ways that matter disproportionately to growing populations. Marine foods can provide fatty acids and micronutrients difficult to obtain in the same combinations inland, especially in poor seasons. Researchers disagree over how strongly such foods shape cognitive evolution in deep time, and exaggerated claims deserve caution, but on a practical level the appeal is clearer. A coastline can help support recurrent occupation because it offers multiple fallback foods. For small mobile populations entering uncertain lands, redundancy is survival. As humans move farther into South Asia, the route question becomes even more complex. The Indian subcontinent is not a single corridor, but a vast region of coasts, river systems, tropical forests, dry zones, uplands, and monsoon-driven rhythms. If modern humans reach it early in the later dispersal, they enter one of the great ecological theatres of the planet. Here again, scholars still debate the exact pace and pathways. Some models favour a relatively rapid eastward spread along southern margins. Others emphasise more staggered expansions, pauses, and inland branching. Archaeological evidence from this time remains frustratingly patchy, in places partly because tropical conditions, erosion, later occupation, and underwater loss obscure the record. No single explanation fully accounts for how quickly different parts of South Asia are settled. But the larger pattern is hard to escape. Humans move through it, adapt to it, and do not turn back. The Toba eruption around 74,000 years ago often enters this discussion because it appears at first to threaten the whole dispersal narrative. One of the largest volcanic eruptions of the Quaternary, it spreads ash widely across South Asia and may have caused significant regional or global effects, though scholars still debate just how catastrophic those effects are for human populations. Older versions of the story sometimes imagine Toba as a near-apocalyptic bottleneck that almost wipes out humans. That view has softened. Evidence from archaeological sites in India suggests continuity of occupation across the ash layers in at least some areas, implying that human groups endure the event rather than vanish. This is important because it reinforces a broader truth: the dispersal succeeds, not because conditions are always benign, but because humans are becoming remarkably hard to erase. River valleys likely matter as much as coasts, even when they leave fewer romantic impressions. Rivers guide movement inland, connect seasonal camps, and create pockets of abundance in otherwise difficult country. They also carry information. A valley says where game will come, where plants may flourish, where fresh water can be found repeatedly, where travel can proceed without constant disorientation. In this sense, rivers are inland coastlines, linear ecologies that reduce uncertainty. Early humans moving east do not need to choose between shore and river in any absolute way. They can use both, weaving between them as conditions demand. South and Southeast Asia would also confront these populations with new forests, monsoon systems, tropical disease environments, and unfamiliar prey. These are not trivial obstacles. It is one thing to cross open or semi-open country in Southwest Asia. It is another to thrive in humid forests and seasonal tropical worlds that place different demands on movement and subsistence. Yet Homo sapiens proves capable of doing so. That alone says much about the species. By this point, humans are not locked to one kind of landscape. They are increasingly able to treat each new environment as a puzzle that can be solved through observation, cooperation, and cultural adjustment. This is where the cumulative nature of human adaptation becomes especially visible. A people spreading along coasts and river corridors do not start from zero each time. They carry fire tool-making traditions, social learning, childcare systems, alliance structures, and remembered strategies for dealing with uncertainty. A new shellfish bed does not need an entirely new kind of mind to exploit it. A new monsoon rhythm does not require genetic transformation before behavior can begin to respond. Culture again does a great deal of the adaptive work. The niche remains portable because people keep transporting more than their bodies. At some stage, this eastward movement becomes extraordinary in scale. To reach Sahul, the ancient combined landmass of Australia and New Guinea, under lower sea levels, humans must eventually cross stretches of open water, even if not vast oceanic distances in the modern sense. This means some groups moving through island Southeast Asia are already capable of planning crossings, whether by simple watercraft rafts or repeated short island hops with inevitable sea passages between. The exact methods remain uncertain because wood fibre and other perishable materials almost never survive from this depth of time. But the conclusion itself is difficult to avoid. Humans are now moving not just across connected land corridors but across water barriers that would have stopped many other species cold. That reality throws fresh light back onto the route through South Asia. These are not just walkers drifting indefinitely along shore. They are strategic movers able to recognize opportunities beyond immediate sight and coordinate risky passages. Even if the first sea crossings are short, they still require foresight, social trust, and some tolerance for uncertainty beyond the horizon. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that by this stage human movement is increasingly buffered by imagination. People no longer need to see all of the world in order to go farther into it, and still there is no single highway. Some groups may remain near coasts for long spans. Others turn inland and adapt to riverine or woodland settings. Some regions may be settled gradually, others more quickly. Some populations likely disappear along the route. The successful expansion remains ragged and plural. Scholars still debate how much of East and Southeast Asia is reached by one early wave, by several, or by later back-and-forth movements that complicate any simple model. But none of that reduces the essential fact. Once humans begin following shores, seasons, and corridors with enough persistence, distance itself starts to lose its power to contain them. The old barriers have not vanished. Deserts still threaten. Monsoons can fail. Coasts can be storm-beaten and deceptive. Rivers can flood or dry. Dense forests can absorb people and evidence alike. Yet the species moving through these landscapes now has a new quality continuity across unfamiliar ground. It is not just entering new places, it is learning how to keep entering new places without the whole process collapsing. That may be the deepest importance of these eastern routes. They show that the great expansion is sustained not by one perfect path, but by a repertoire of movement. Shorelines, rivers, seasonal wetlands, inland plains, and island arcs all become pieces of the same adaptive strategy. Humans follow what the year allows, what the land offers, and what memory can hold. And as they do, the world east of Africa stops being a fringe and becomes a lived geography. The trail stretches through Arabia and South Asia, toward lands where other human species already dwell, where unfamiliar climates wait, and where the next great chapter of the story will unfold, not in empty space, but in occupied worlds. The world humans enter beyond Africa is not theirs alone. This matters more than almost any older telling of the story ever allowed. For a long time, prehistory was narrated as if modern humans stepped out into empty continents, meeting only climate distance and wild animals. The deeper record tells something far stranger. Eurasia is already inhabited by other kinds of humans, close relatives, intelligent, adaptable, experienced, and in some places long established. Neanderthals occupy much of Western Eurasia. Denisovans, more elusive in the bones than in the genes, inhabit parts of Asia and leave traces of their presence across enormous distances. Other lineages may also exist dimly seen or not yet fully understood. So when Homo sapiens keeps moving east and north, in this later expansion, it is not entering a vacant stage. It is entering a crowded human world. That changes the emotional texture of the whole migration. The newcomers are not the only toolmakers, not the only fire users, not the only cooperative hunters. Somewhere beyond the next ridge may be people who look broadly familiar at a glance and deeply unfamiliar up close. They may use the same caves in different seasons. They may know the same game routes better than the arrivals do. They may leave tools in styles that overlap or diverge. The first meetings are lost to time, and scholars still debate what form many of these encounters take: brief, hostile, curious, indifferent, intimate. The evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the record suggests one thing: with growing force, these populations do not merely replace one another at a distance. They meet. Neanderthals are the best known of these other humans, partly because their bones are more abundant and partly because they have long haunted the modern imagination. They are not brutish failures despite the endurance of that caricature. They are people of cold margins, steppe, woodland, and shifting ice age ecologies, skilled at hunting large game, using fire-making tools and surviving across hundreds of thousands of years in conditions that would kill most creatures quickly. Their bodies are built for strength, for power, for conserving heat. Their lives are hard, intimate, with risk, and locally deep. By the time Homo sapiens pushes into Western Eurasia, in a sustained way, Neanderthals have histories there far older than any modern human presence. This makes the later success of Homo sapiens more impressive, but also more complicated. It cannot simply be a story of one superior species sweeping aside inferior rivals. No single explanation fully accounts for the outcome, and scholars still debate the balance between climate, population size, cultural flexibility, disease competition, and sheer bad luck. What is increasingly clear is that Neanderthals are capable, resilient humans in their own right. Their disappearance, therefore, demands explanation, not dismissal. The Denisovans are stranger still because so much of what is known about them comes not from skulls or skeletons, but from genes. A finger bone, a few teeth fragments from caves, and then the startling revelation that living humans in parts of Asia and Oceania carry Denisovan ancestry. In some populations, the signal is substantial. This means Homo sapiens does not merely pass through Denisovan worlds. It meets Denisovans closely enough to have children with them, and those descendants endure. The geographic spread of Denisovan genetic traces suggests a population or network of populations far wider than the sparse fossil record once hinted. One lesser-known detail is how this genetic evidence has turned prehistory inside out. Whole human histories now appear first in DNA and only later, if ever, in the ground. The implication is difficult to overstate. The expansion out of Africa is not a clean replacement event. It is a braided encounter. Modern humans move into lands occupied by relatives, exchange genes. With them, perhaps share or imitate some behaviors, compete with them, and eventually outlast them. The old image of separate species passing like ships in the night has been shattered. Modern people outside Africa still carry small percentages of Neanderthal ancestry. Some populations also carry Denisovan ancestry, and in certain environments those inherited genes appear to have mattered. The EPAS1 variant associated with high-altitude adaptation in Tibetans is a famous example of Denisovan contribution helping later humans thrive in thin-air environments. In a profound sense, Homo sapiens takes over the world, partly by becoming in small measure a composite of the humans already there. That does not mean contact is always peaceful or meaningful in any sentimental way. Gene flow can happen in brief encounters, unequal encounters, rare encounters. Violence, avoidance, rivalry, and uneasy coexistence may all be part of the picture. The record cannot easily tell us the emotional tone of these meetings. A cave may preserve alternating occupations rather than direct overlap. A genetic signal may reveal one ancient union without describing the surrounding circumstances, but what survives in the record suggests these encounters are real, repeated enough to matter, and regionally diverse. There is not one meeting between us and them. There are many meetings spread across millennia and landscapes. Archaeology complicates the story further by showing that behavior often overlaps. Neanderthals use pigments. They make specialized tools. They likely care for injured individuals. They survive in harsh climates and manage fire skillfully. In some places, they may create ornaments or symbolic marks, though the details remain debated. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens arriving from Africa is itself not culturally uniform. Different groups carry different tool traditions and adaptive habits. So the meeting of populations is not between one fully modern package and one static alternative. It is between varied humans all living under pressure, all changing over time, all responding to climate and opportunity. This is where demographic scale may begin to matter more than any single intellectual distinction. Homo sapiens may often operate in larger or more widely connected networks, allowing ideas, mates, and resources to circulate across broader ranges. If that is true, it would not make Neanderthals or Denisovans less intelligent in any crude sense. It would simply mean they are more vulnerable to fragmentation. Small isolated populations can be extremely skilled and still disappear when climates swing, prey bases shift, or neighbours expand. A broader network can absorb local losses and keep going. This may be one of the decisive differences, though the evidence is still debated and no single factor can bear all the weight. The environments in which these encounters happen also matter enormously. In Southwest Asia and parts of Europe, climates fluctuate so sharply that human ranges expand and contract like breathing. A population can dominate a region in one phase and lose it in another. Cold favours one strategy, warmth another. Forest advance changes prey. Open steppe return reshapes mobility. Under such conditions, overlap between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals may be intermittent, region-specific, and deeply sensitive to timing. That makes the disappearance of Neanderthals less like a dramatic final battle, and more like a drawn-out retreat under multiple pressures, punctuated by occasional mixing and local persistence. One surprising feature of this whole process is how little ancestry it takes to leave a lasting legacy. Most non-African modern humans carry only a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, yet those fragments have become part of the biological fabric of billions of people. Denisovan ancestry is unevenly distributed but can be far more pronounced in some populations, especially in parts of Melanesia and related groups. This means that the extinct humans of Eurasia are not simply gone. Their bodies are gone, their cultures mostly lost, their independent lineages ended. But pieces of them continue in the species that outlast them. Extinction here is not absolute erasure. It is absorption at the edges before disappearance at the centre. There may have been more such encounters than we currently know. The human family tree during this period appears less like a neat branching diagram and more like a thicket with repeated contact between branches. Some African populations may also preserve traces of deeply ancient structure or ghost lineages within the continent, though the evidence and interpretation remain under discussion. In Eurasia, the situation is clearer in broad outline but still unfinished in detail. Each new cave, each new genome, each improved dating method has the potential to rearrange the story. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is part of the fascination. Human expansion is not just a migration through space. It is a meeting with other versions of humanity. And yet over time, one pattern becomes unmistakable. Homo sapiens keeps spreading. Neanderthals disappear by around 40,000 years ago, though the exact timing varies by region, and some pockets may endure later than others. Denisovans fade from the record even more obscurely. Other archaic populations vanish or are absorbed. The reasons are likely cumulative, smaller population sizes, environmental stress competition for territory, and prey, possible disease exchange, and the difficulty of remaining viable when faced with the species that connects, adapts, and reproduces across wider networks. No single explanation fully accounts for the outcome, but the consequence is clear. The human world becomes less plural. That reduction is easy to mistake for inevitability when viewed backward. It was nothing of the sort. For long stretches, the planet is inhabited by several kinds of humans at once. Different bodies, different histories, different local knowledge systems share overlapping lands. Modern humans are one participant in that broader human ecology, not its predetermined endpoint. Their eventual global dominance is therefore more contingent and more haunting than the word dominance suggests. They do not conquer an empty world. They inherit a world from relatives they meet, mingle with, and outlast. By the time this chapter is closing, Homo sapiens is no longer merely leaving Africa or learning to move through Arabia and South Asia. It is becoming the only human species left alive, even as it carries traces of the others within itself. The takeover of the world is beginning to look less like a straightforward victory and more like a great narrowing. The old plurality of humans is fading. One lineage remains. It carries borrowed genes, adapted habits, and an expanding sense that no landscape is permanently beyond reach. The question now is not whether this species can live alongside other humans. It is why it keeps moving even after so much of the world is already opening beneath its feet. Why do they keep going? It is the question that sits behind the entire migration, and it is harder to answer than the question of how. The mechanics of dispersal can be traced through bones, tools, sediment, climate records, and genes. The motive cannot. No preserved thought survives from the people who continue east-north and eventually into worlds no human ancestors have ever seen. There is no ancient declaration of purpose, there is only pattern. Again and again, once movement becomes viable, Homo sapiens does not simply settle one new region and stop. It spreads, branches, tests margins, returns, pushes outward again. The rhythm suggests something deeper than one temporary emergency, yet no single explanation fully accounts for it. Population pressure is one of the oldest and simplest explanations. As populations grow in favourable refuge or productive zones, local resources become harder to share. Young families split away, rivalries sharpen, marginal lands begin to look more attractive. This almost certainly happens sometimes. It would be surprising if it did not. Small-scale fission is common in mobile human societies, and one group's need for room can become the first step in a larger expansion. But population pressure by itself does not explain the full pattern. People do not always move far when numbers rise. They can alter social rules, intensify local use, or shift seasonally instead. Pressure may trigger departures, yet it does not explain why departures continue through wildly different ecologies once the original crowding is left behind. Resource stress offers a related but darker version of the same idea. Drought prey, decline, unstable rainfall, or disruption of familiar foraging patterns can make movement necessary rather than optional. In this model, humans keep going because staying put becomes too risky. Again, that almost certainly captures part of reality. Climate instability is woven through the story from the start, and many local movements likely begin with scarcity. But this explanation also has limits. Some dispersals happen through regions that seem relatively rich at the time. Some movements continue beyond obvious refuges rather than ending in them. A species fleeing hunger does not always cross yet another ridge once food is found. Something more than desperation seems to be at work. One possibility is that humans are not only pushed but pulled, drawn by opportunity visible at the edges of the known world. A distant valley holds game, a coastline continues beyond the last camp, another river system promises water shellfish, birds and transport. A neighbouring group speaks of a greener stretch farther on. The unfamiliar is not empty mystery, it is often a pattern of hints. In that sense, migration may be less about heroic wandering than about the extension of ordinary ecological reasoning. If the last 100 miles have offered usable country, why would the next 100 be unimaginable? What begins as local opportunism can over generations become continental movement. This is where human cognition may matter in a very particular way. Homo sapiens seems unusually able to act on incomplete but plausible models of the world. People can infer that a coast likely continues, that a river has an upper course, that migrating animals come from somewhere and return somewhere, that rain falling over distant hills may feed water beyond immediate sight. This is not abstract science in the modern sense. It is predictive imagination grounded in observation. Scholars still debate how distinctive this quality is compared with that of other hominins, but in Homo sapiens it appears to scale powerfully when joined to language and collective memory. A species able to imagine the next landscape before entering it is a species more likely to keep moving. Social forces may also matter far more than older ecological models once allowed. Humans are deeply social and often intensely competitive in subtle ways. Groups compare themselves to neighbouring groups. Prestige access to mates' alliance opportunities and the need to avoid conflict can all shape movement. A younger branch of a population may drift outward, not because the land behind is empty, but because social space within it is constrained. New ground offers more than food. It offers autonomy. One lesser-known strength of this explanation is that it fits human behaviour at many scales. Movement does not require a continent-wide crisis if smaller social tensions repeatedly generate outward fusion. Exchange networks may reinforce this process. Once people are linked across distances, information about places travels farther than individuals do. A population does not have to discover every route from scratch if materials, mates, stories and warnings circulate. This makes movement cheaper in informational terms. The world beyond the current horizon is still risky, but it is less opaque. A region known indirectly through others becomes easier to approach. And when a group succeeds in occupying it, that success itself becomes information that can encourage further branching. Migration then becomes cumulative, not only biologically but socially. The route is not just walked, it is narrated. There is also a simpler and more difficult possibility: curiosity. Scholars are rightly cautious about projecting modern romantic ideas of exploration into deep prehistory, and curiosity alone would be a weak explanation if treated as some mystical inner drive. But in small practical form it may still matter. Humans investigate. They scout beyond immediate need. They notice smoke on distant ridges, animal paths leading out of familiar country coastal stretches, not yet visited passes opening beyond a seasonal camp. Such acts are not grand expeditions. They are extensions of normal foraging intelligence. Yet repeated over enough generations, they give migration an exploratory edge. The species may not set out to discover the world, but it may be unusually disposed to keep probing its margins. Competing explanations often sound contradictory when they may actually be complementary. Population pressure can combine with opportunity. Climate stress can coincide with social fission. Curiosity can operate inside pragmatic scouting. A good shoreline can tempt outward movement just as conditions behind worsen. No single explanation fully accounts for the momentum of expansion, Because the momentum itself is probably assembled from many local motives. One group leaves for room, another for water, another follows kin, another avoids rivals, another chases seasonal abundance farther than before. The astonishing global pattern emerges from motives that are at each step immediate and human-sized. Still, Homo sapiens appears to carry one distinctive advantage into all of this cumulative culture. Other animals move, some even move farther relative to their size than humans do. But they do not usually transform movement into a growing archive of portable solutions. Humans leave one place carrying remembered fire practices, tool designs, childcare systems, medicinal knowledge, hunting tactics, symbolic markers of group identity, and stories about how to behave in uncertainty. When they reach the next place, they do not start from animal innocence. They begin with a kit of learned possibilities. Success need not be invented anew each time. It can be adapted from older successes. That cumulative quality may also create its own momentum. Once humans learn that movement can work, movement becomes a strategy more available to future generations. The idea of relocation enters the species' behavioral repertoire. A dry spell is no longer met only with endurance or local adjustment. It can also be met with departure. A rival group's pressure does not always end in submission or war. It can end in branching away. This does not sound dramatic, but it changes the range of imaginable responses. The more often movement succeeds somewhere in the network, the more thinkable it becomes elsewhere. There may even be a feedback loop between movement and identity. Groups that move successfully may develop stronger habits of planning, alliance making, and adaptability, which in turn make further movement easier. Children raised in mobile societies learn flexibility as normal life. Elders carry root memory. Material culture favors portability. Social rules adapt to shifting camp composition and long-distance kin ties. In such groups, dispersal stops being exceptional. It becomes embedded. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeology can only infer these dynamics indirectly, but the logic is compelling. A moving species may become better at moving precisely because it has moved before, yet it is worth resisting one seductive but misleading idea that humans keep going because they are somehow destined to conquer restless by nature in a nearly metaphysical way. That story says more about much later empires than about Paleolithic life. Early humans are not abstract embodiments of expansion. They are communities managing risk. They keep going because under certain conditions going is a workable answer, and because their social and cognitive equipment lets that answer travel farther than it can in other species. The result looks world historical from our distance. Up close it may feel like countless practical decisions made by people who never imagine the whole. And then there is the uncomfortable possibility that success itself creates new pressure. As humans enter more regions, they affect prey populations, occupy key habitats, and multiply their own branching opportunities. A successful group gives rise to daughter groups. Daughter groups need room. Room is found farther on. Expansion can therefore become self-amplifying without ever requiring a central motive larger than ordinary human life. The world keeps opening and humans keep making use of the opening. So why do they keep going? Because they can increasingly. Because staying is sometimes dangerous and leaving is sometimes promising. Because information travels. Because social worlds split and reform. Because coasts continue and rivers lead somewhere. Because children inherit not just genes, but roots, stories, and habits of adaptation. Because the species is not built for one fixed niche and one fixed answer. It is built awkwardly and brilliantly for adjustment. That is why the expansion does not end at Arabia or South Asia. It continues into colder, stranger, more punishing margins, where grass gives way to steppe, where winter ceases to be an inconvenience and becomes a governing fact. The question of motive will remain, but the next challenge is no longer why humans keep moving. It is how they survive when the world ahead is made of ice wind and distances far harsher than anything their African ancestors had ever known. The world at the edge of ice does not welcome human beings. It strips warmth from the body, shortens the day, hardens the ground, and punishes mistakes with a speed that hot climates rarely match. Wind crosses open steppe like a blade. Winter darkness lingers. Plant foods grow scarce for long stretches. Herds move across immense distances, and to follow them is to enter a landscape where shelter is uncertain and exposure can kill silently. If the earlier chapters of human expansion are about finding corridors through changeable but often productive country, this chapter is about something more severe. It is about whether a species shaped in Africa and spread through warmer belts of Eurasia can survive the cold margins of the north. The answer astonishingly is yes, but not by strength alone. By the time Homo sapiens pushes deeper into Eurasia's colder zones, other humans have already shown that such lands are livable. Neanderthals in particular are long familiar with glacial climates, steppe edges and harsh seasonal worlds. Modern humans entering these regions do not invent cold survival out of nothing. They enter an environment already known at least to other human populations and must solve it in their own way. Scholars still debate how much knowledge may pass between groups, whether directly or indirectly, and the evidence remains incomplete. But what survives in the record suggests Homo sapiens develops a package of behaviors and technologies that let it endure not merely an occasional cold season, but an entire ecology structured by winter. Clothing is central, though frustratingly invisible in the archaeological record because hide, sinew, leather and plant fibers decay so easily. Needles made from bone appear later in the story with greater clarity, but tailored or semi-tailored garments likely precede some of the best evidence for them. No human body can simply walk into Ice Age Eurasia without serious protection. This seems obvious, yet it is one of the most consequential thresholds in the whole migration. A species once limited largely by its exposed skin begins to use animal bodies as climate armor. Fur becomes portable shelter. Layers become stored warmth. In evolutionary terms, culture once again does what biology alone cannot do quickly enough. Fire matters even more here than before. In Africa and warmer Eurasia, it is transformative. In colder latitudes, it becomes nearly inseparable from life itself. Fire warms camps, preserves social space. After dark hardens, tools processes food, drives predators away, and makes cold regions psychologically habitable. A group that can reliably make, maintain and transport fire through long-distance movement carries with it a pocket of survivable climate. This is one reason hearths are so evocative in Paleolithic sites. They are not merely places where people cooked. In a cold landscape, a hearth is an island of human order. Shelter too becomes more deliberate. Caves and rock shelters are valuable, but they are not always where the herds are. Open-air structures, windbreaks, mammoth bone constructions in some later contexts, hide-covered frames, repeated camp layouts, these hint at a species increasingly able to create habitation rather than simply find it. One lesser-known detail is that successful cold climate occupation may depend less on heroic endurance than on micro-decisions about camp placement, a slope out of the wind, access to fuel drainage, visibility of prey, proximity to water that will not trap people in ice. The archaeology of cold survival often looks humble because its genius is practical. Planning becomes more demanding in these northern and interior worlds. In a rich shoreline or temperate corridor, mistakes can sometimes be corrected quickly. In cold steppe or near glacial margins, a failed plan can become fatal before help arrives. Fuel must be anticipated. Food must sometimes be stored or at least procured with greater reliability. Movement must account for snow-frozen water and the seasonal behavior of animals. The year itself becomes sharper. Winter and summer are not just variations, they are different worlds. A species that can organize life across both has crossed another threshold in its transformation into a global one. This is where cooperation shows its full weight. Cold regions magnify the value of shared labor. Large prey can feed many people if hunted well. Hide processing requires skill and time. Firewood collection or alternative fuel use matters. Childcare in harsh weather becomes more demanding. Illness or injury becomes deadlier without group support. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that Homo sapiens succeeds in part because it maintains social worlds large and flexible enough to spread risk. No single explanation fully accounts for the occupation of these regions, yet it is hard to imagine it without dense cooperation. The prey itself shapes human expansion northward. Mammoth reindeer, horse bison, and other large Ice Age animals structure movement across steppe and tundra margins. Humans do not merely enter cold landscapes. They enter hunting systems synchronized to the movement of these animals. This requires different rhythms from those of tropical coastlines or African savannas. It demands timing knowledge of migration routes and the ability to turn an animal into almost everything meat. Fat, hide, bones, sinew, fuel, tools. In some ways, large cold-adapted prey make northern occupation possible. In other ways, dependence on them ties human survival to unstable ecological webs that can shift under climatic pressure. The north also forces a deeper engagement with seasonality than many earlier environments. In warmer regions, scarcity and abundance alternate, but the cold extremes of Eurasia impose more rigid cycles of light temperature and resource availability. Summer may offer movement and hunting opportunity across broad ranges. Winter constricts options, increases energy demands, and narrows the margin for error. A people living in such places must think seasonally with unusual precision. Scholars still debate how early storage, delayed return systems, and complex scheduling develop in different regions, but the larger truth is clear. Time itself becomes a tool. Survival depends on reading the year correctly. This push into harsh margins is not confined to the far north alone. Island chains, uplands, deserts at the edge of cold interiors, and ecotones between forest and steppe all become laboratories of adaptation. Humans prove not just that they can cross difficult terrain, but that they can keep living in worlds that punish generic solutions. One strategy will not fit everything. Clothing that works in one climate fails in another. Hunting methods must change with prey and ground conditions. Camps suitable for woodland differ from those on open plain. This constant revision may be one of the deepest strengths of Homo sapiens. The species does not solve the world once. It keeps solving it differently. There is also a psychological achievement here that is easy to overlook. To live in a frigid landscape is not only to endure cold, it is to accept unfamiliar beauty and danger as ordinary. Frozen rivers become roads or traps. Snow becomes signal cover and hazard. Distant herds on pale ground must be read at a glance. Long, dark hours alter social life around firelight. Children raised in such places would inhabit a sensory world radically different from that of their African ancestors, yet fully human in its familiarity to them. This is how expansion becomes irreversible. New worlds stop feeling foreign when they become the world in which one grows up. One surprising detail from later, Upper Paleolithic context helps hint at how complete this transformation becomes. Some sites reveal not just survival, but art ornament and careful spatial organization in environments that older generations of archaeologists once imagined as too brutal for anything beyond raw subsistence. Even if some of these fluorescences come slightly later than the first cold incursions, they point to the same underlying truth. Humans do not merely scrape by in difficult regions. Given time and continuity, they make them cultural worlds. All the same, the edge of ice remains dangerous. Populations can contract or vanish when climate shifts suddenly. Cold-adapted prey can decline. Expanding glaciers' aridity or changing vegetation can reroute migration patterns and empty old hunting grounds. Some northern occupations are likely temporary, others pulse in and out with warming and cooling phases. The evidence remains incomplete, and not every advance into harsh country becomes permanent. But by now, the overall pattern no longer depends on any single branch holding forever. Humans are spread widely enough that local collapse does not erase the species' broader momentum. That may be the most important difference between these later expansions and the failed exits long before. Earlier pioneering groups can vanish and take the trail with them. Now the species is too distributed, too connected in broad terms, and too behaviourally flexible for any one setback to restore the old limits. A harsh winter can kill a band. A climatic downturn can empty a region. But elsewhere, humans remain adjust and eventually move again. The frontier has changed from a fragile threshold into a shifting but permeable zone, and so the edge of ice and ocean becomes something other than an ending. It becomes proof that Homo sapiens can occupy not just fertile corridors and forgiving coastlines, but severe margins once thought beyond its range. This species, armed with hide-fire memory planning and cooperation, can turn bitter wind into a problem rather than a verdict. That discovery opens far more than the North. It opens the possibility of Europe in full of Ice Age adaptations across Eurasia, of island crossings farther east, and of a future in which almost no habitable world remains beyond human reach. By now the expansion has become something no earlier human movement ever was not, a temporary excursion, not a fragile foothold, but a widening occupation of vastly different worlds at nearly the same broad span of prehistory. To the west lies Europe, cold, broken, ecologically unstable, and already haunted by the long presence of Neanderthals. To the southeast lie island chains, monsoon worlds, and sea barriers that demand a new kind of nerve. Beyond them lies Sahul, the ancient joined land mass of Australia and New Guinea, under lower sea levels separated from Asia, not by fantasy oceans but by enough open water to matter. If humans can reach both Europe and Sahul within the general sweep of this later dispersal, then something profound has happened. The species is no longer merely extending its range. It is demonstrating that radically different frontiers can be entered, learned, and held. Europe is often imagined as the great proving ground, and in one sense it is. Modern humans entering it face environments that can be brutally seasonal landscapes, already familiar to Neanderthals, and ecological patterns very different from the African and Southern Asian worlds out of which their expansion began. Dates remain debated in detail, and the pace varies by region, but by roughly 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens is clearly present across parts of Europe, with earlier appearances in some southeastern zones, and later spread westward and northward. The record is not perfectly continuous. Scholars still debate the exact chronology of first arrivals, the degree of overlap with late Neanderthals, and how different archaeological cultures relate to one another. But what survives in the record suggests that once modern humans enter Europe in force, the continent does not remain beyond them for long. The emotional tone of this occupation must have been extraordinary, though only inference can reach it. Europe at this time is not the settled mosaic of later farms and towns. It is a land of cold valleys, open steppe forest margins, cave systems, roaming herds and predators whose names now feel half-mythic: cave lions, hyenas, bears. Glaciers breathe at the edges of human range. Winds can cut through poor shelter. Game routes matter more than any path later history will remember. To live here requires not only technical adaptation, but social steadiness under pressure. A people crossing into Europe must learn quickly which valleys hold prey through winter, which shelters can be returned to, which stone sources justify long travel, and which local rhythms cannot be ignored. There is no room for generic living. Yet Europe also reveals something else about Homo sapiens, not just endurance, but expressive abundance. Within tens of thousands of years of arrival, and perhaps in some cases surprisingly quickly, depending on how one interprets the record, modern humans in Europe leave unmistakable signs of symbolic and artistic life ornaments, carved figures, bone tools of great delicacy, and eventually the cave art that has so powerfully shaped our sense of the Ice Age mind. These flourishing expressions belong mostly to later phases after first arrival, and scholars still debate how abrupt or gradual the cultural transitions really are. Still, the larger point matters. Humans do not merely survive Europe, they make it meaningful. Caves are not only shelter, they become places of image, memory, and perhaps ritual. In a cold and often severe continent, culture thickens rather than thins. This does not mean Europe is conquered in one smooth wave. Different regions are occupied, abandoned, revisited, and reorganized as climate shifts. Some groups disappear, others spread. The edge between modern humans and remaining Neanderthal populations may vary from one region to another, sometimes separated by time, sometimes overlapping more closely. The disappearance of Neanderthals, likely complete by around 40,000 years ago, though perhaps with some late holdouts in isolated pockets, unfolds against this broader background of modern human expansion, climatic instability, and demographic asymmetry. No single explanation fully accounts for the result, but once again the pattern is cumulative. Homo sapiens enters a world already inhabited, adapts to it, and remains. If Europe shows that humans can settle a cold and contested continent, Sahul shows something even stranger, that they can cross into a continent requiring intentional sea passage. Reaching Sahul by at least around 65,000 years ago, and perhaps earlier depending on ongoing debates, means that populations moving through Southeast Asia do not stop at the water's edge. They continue through island landscapes and cross channels that could not have been traversed simply by waiting for lower sea level to expose land bridges all the way through. Even at glacial low stands, stretches of open water remain. This is one of the most astonishing thresholds in the entire story of human expansion. The practical details are maddeningly obscure. Boats, rafts, lashed logs, reed bundles, bamboo craft, none survive from this time, and any reconstruction must remain cautious. Scholars still debate whether the crossings are deliberate explorations, accidental drifts followed by successful establishment, or, more likely, some combination of repeated short-range water travel and occasional riskier passages. But accident alone struggles to explain colonization at scale. The evidence remains incomplete, yet what survives in the record strongly suggests planning, group coordination, and at least some willingness to move toward land not fully continuous with the familiar one. This is not oceanic voyaging in the later Polynesian sense, but it is still a remarkable feat of foresight. One lesser-known aspect of the Sahul story is how different the target world is from Eurasia. Australia and New Guinea, together under lower sea levels, contain deserts, tropical forests, savannas, uplands, giant marsupials, reptilian predators, and ecological combinations unlike those of Africa, Europe, or Western Asia. A people arriving there cannot rely on any one prior adaptation. They must discover new prey behaviors, new plants, new seasonal rhythms, new dangers. The very strangeness of the fauna matters. This is a world of giant kangaroos, diprotodons, marsupial lions, enormous birds and reptiles whose ecological roles reflect a long isolation. Humans entering Sahul therefore meet not just a new continent but a new evolutionary theatre, and still they spread through it. Archaeological evidence from Australia points towards surprisingly early human presence in multiple regions, implying that colonization after arrival does not remain confined to one small coastal enclave. Movement inland follows. Adaptation diversifies. Fire regimes may begin to change under human influence, though the scale, timing, and ecological consequences are actively debated. Scholars still argue over how quickly megafaunal decline follows human arrival, and how much climate contributes relative to hunting habitat alteration and burning. No single explanation fully accounts for every extinction pattern. But what survives in the record suggests that Homo sapiens is now not just entering continents, it is beginning to transform them. This is one of the first places where human expansion starts to look like ecological power. Not power in a modern industrial sense, but the quiet and accumulating power of a highly adaptable hunter-gatherer species entering isolated ecosystems unaccustomed to its combination of intelligence, cooperation, fire use, and flexible predation. The consequences may unfold over centuries or millennia, rather than in a sudden crash, but the direction of change is hard to ignore. Australia becomes a test case for something that will later repeat elsewhere. Wherever humans go, landscapes may cease to remain entirely what they were before. Europe and Sahul together therefore reveal the true scale of the transformation underway. One branch of the species is adapting to cold, predator-rich, long-inhabited Eurasian worlds, shaped by glacial rhythms and other humans. Another is crossing sea barriers into a continent of unfamiliar fauna and ecological isolation. These are not minor variants of the same challenge, they are radically different problems. The fact that Homo sapiens can solve both within the broad sweep of the late Pleistocene says more than any single innovation ever could. It says the species' core strength is not one particular adaptation, but adaptive range itself. This range is cultural before it is biological. Fire clothing, cooperative childcare toolkits, memory of roots, symbolic markers of belonging, flexible diet, seasonal planning, perhaps watercraft, perhaps deliberate burning. These portable systems allow humans to rebuild life under new rules again and again. That is why the expansion does not break when environments diverge sharply. A specialist species might have succeeded in Europe or Sahul, but not both. Homo sapiens succeeds because it carries methods of adjustment rather than a single perfected form of life. There is also a deep irony here. The farther humans spread, the less any one population can understand the whole human world. A child growing up in Ice Age Europe and one growing up in Pleistocene Sahul belong to the same species, yet their climates, animals, dangers, and daily skills may differ almost beyond recognition. Human unity is expanding through human divergence. The species is becoming global not by staying the same in every detail, but by learning how to become local everywhere. By this point, the old question, why did humans leave Africa, has already begun to change into a larger one. Why did this one species prove able to occupy such different worlds while all other humans vanished? The answer lies partly in everything that has come before: climate windows, social networks, portable culture, repeated learning, and the capacity to keep moving after failure. But those causes now gather into an even broader effect. Humans are no longer a clever African primate testing the edges of another continent. They are becoming the dominant adaptable animal on Earth, one capable of turning deserts cold steppes, forests, islands, and unfamiliar continents into lived human space. The final great frontier still lies ahead across Beringia and into the Americas, but by now the pattern is unmistakable. Very little of the habitable world remains outside the human experiment. At the far edge of the Ice Age world, where Siberia thins toward the Arctic and the continents nearly touch, there is no sign announcing a new hemisphere. There is only cold land swept by wind, crossed by herds marked by rivers that freeze and break with the seasons. Sea levels are lower now because so much water is locked in ice, and what later becomes the Bering Strait is at certain times a broad stretch of exposed ground we call Beringia. It is not simply a bridge in the narrow sense, not a thin causeway hurried across and forgotten. It is a real landscape, cold, grassy, in places ecologically productive in its own severe way, and capable of supporting human as well as animal life. If humans reach the Americas, and the evidence now makes clear that they do not arrive by magic or in a single clean moment. They arrive through this vast northern threshold by routes and timings that remain some of the most fiercely debated in all prehistory. For a long time, the old story seemed straightforward. Humans crossed Beringia late in the Ice Age, entered North America through an ice-free corridor between the Great Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, and then spread rapidly southward, giving rise to the Clovis culture, whose distinctive stone points were once treated as the first clear signal of humans in the Americas. It was a powerful model because it was simple, elegant, and backed by striking archaeological finds. But simplicity has not survived. Over recent decades, new sites improved dating methods, genetic evidence, paleo-ecological reconstructions, and reanalysis of older discoveries have steadily complicated the picture. The peopling of the Americas now looks earlier, messier, and more regionally varied than the classic Clovis first narrative allowed. The first complication is timing. Genetic evidence suggests the ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas branch off from Northeast Asian populations, well before the widespread Clovis horizon, implying a deeper prehistory in or near Beringia. Some researchers propose a period of relative isolation, sometimes called the Beringian standstill, in which ancestral populations remain in or around Beringia for thousands of years before moving farther into the continents. Scholars still debate the scale and exact chronology of this standstill, and no single explanation fully accounts for every genetic pattern. But the larger point is compelling. Beringia is not just a crossing. It may be a homeland of sorts for a time, a place where populations pause, adapt, and diversify before the wider Americas open. The second complication is route. The famous interior ice-free corridor may not have been biologically viable early enough to account for the oldest credible human presence south of the ice sheets. Even if the corridor exists physically, it must also contain enough plants, animals, and fresh water to support moving human groups. Increasingly, many scholars argue that a Pacific coastal route, likely involving movement along shorelines, estuaries, kelp-rich marine environments, and perhaps short sea crossings or shoreline travel by simple watercraft, may have been crucial, especially in the earlier phases. The evidence remains incomplete because so much of the late Pleistocene coastline now lies underwater, but what survives in the record suggests that coastal movement is not only plausible, it may solve several of the timing problems the interior corridor leaves unresolved. Sites such as Monteverde in southern Chile play an outsized role here because they force the argument away from old certainties. Monteverde, with strong evidence for human presence around 14,500 years ago, and perhaps even earlier, signals still debated places people astonishingly far south in the Americas, earlier than Clovis can comfortably explain as the first entry. If humans are already in southern South America by then, they must have entered the continents earlier still. Other sites, from Bluefish Caves in the Yukon to Paisley Caves in Oregon, from White Sands in New Mexico, with its controversial but potentially very early trackways, to various pre-Clovis localities across the Americas, continue to expand and complicate the picture. Some claims remain disputed, some dates are challenged. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate which sites are decisive and which are overinterpreted. Yet the general trend is unmistakable. Humans reached the Americas before the old textbook story once allowed. What would this movement have felt like? As always, the answer must be inferred. A people living in Beringia or moving along the North Pacific Rim would face cold, shifting coastlines, ice margins, dangerous weather, and ecologies full of both opportunity and risk. Marine resources may have mattered greatly if the coastal route is as important as many now think. Fish seabirds, shellfish marine mammals, and kelp forest ecosystems could provide a surprisingly rich corridor along otherwise difficult shores. Inland mammoth steppe environments and later deglaciating landscapes would offer game but also immense uncertainty. A group moving into the Americas would not know it had entered continents without end. It would only know that the land continued opening southward into ecologies with no ancestral memory attached to them. That opening may be one of the strangest moments in human history. For tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens has been expanding into lands already inhabited by other humans. In the Americas, so far as current evidence shows, there are no Neanderthals, no Denisovans, no parallel human species waiting there. The newcomers are alone in that sense, though, not alone among dangers. The landscapes are full of giant animals, mastodons, mammoths, giant ground sloths, horses, camels in North America, glyptodonts and saber-toothed cats farther south, immense birds, dire wolves, short-faced bears. To enter the Americas is therefore to enter a world at once empty of other humans and crowded with ecological possibility. One lesser-known detail is how quickly adaptation must diversify once people move south of the northern ice margins. The Americas are not one environment. They include Arctic tundra, boreal forest, open plains, deserts, mountain chains, temperate coasts, tropical forests, wetlands, and high-altitude plateaus. If humans spread through them within a few thousand years, as much evidence suggests, then this is one of the most dramatic demonstrations of the species' flexibility anywhere in the record. A population descended from people negotiating Beringian cold and Pacific Rim ecologies can within a geologically brief interval be living in the Andes, the Amazonian fringe, the North American plains desert basins, and the far south of South America. The distances are staggering, but so is the adaptive range. This is part of why the peopling of the Americas matters so much to the broader human story. It is not merely the filling in of the last blank spaces, it is the final proof that no habitable continent remains beyond the reach of Homo sapiens. The species that once hesitated at the edge of Africa is now crossing into hemispheres its ancestors could never have imagined. And it does so not with cities farming or metal, but with Paleolithic tools, social coordination, ecological knowledge, and portable culture. That is a level of capability easy to underestimate because it is not industrial, yet it is among the most consequential achievements in the history of life. The ecological consequences, however, are difficult and controversial. Across the Americas, as in Sahul and later in many islands, human arrival broadly overlaps with the decline and extinction of many large animals. Mammoths, mastodons, giant sloths, American horses, camels, and numerous others vanish by the end of the Pleistocene, though not all at once and not always in the same ways. Scholars still debate the balance between overhunting, climate change, habitat shifts, fire regimes, disease, and cascading ecological interactions. No single explanation fully accounts for every extinction pattern, and different species in different regions likely respond to different combinations of stress. But what survives in the record suggests that the arrival of humans is one major new force in ecosystems already under climatic strain. Once again, the spread of Homo sapiens changes not only who lives in a place, but what kind of place it remains. There is also a human consequence harder to measure, but just as important. Once populations are established across the Americas, the species is in effect planetary. There are still islands left to reach later, still remote environments to fully occupy, still countless local adaptations and cultural worlds yet to arise. But the great continental arc is complete. Africa, Eurasia, Sahul, and now the Americas all hold modern humans. The old condition of being a regional primate is over. The human world now wraps the globe even if its far-flung populations do not know of one another's existence. That ignorance is itself haunting. A person in late Pleistocene Patagonia and a person in Central Africa belong to the same species, share deep ancestry, and would recognize one another as human in an immediate bodily sense. Yet they live in separate mental universes under different skies, among different animals, telling different stories, wearing different materials, and moving within different limits of the imaginable. Humanity has spread across the world, but not into one shared world. That will come much later, and only partially. For now, the global species exists as a scatter of local worlds stitched together only by descent. The debates over route and timing will continue as they should. New coastal discoveries may transform the argument again. Sites once dismissed may be revived. Celebrated claims may weaken under scrutiny. The evidence remains incomplete, especially because so much of the old shoreline archive is underwater, and because the earliest sites can be ephemeral. Still, the larger truth no longer depends on one perfect model. Humans enter the Americas before the end of the Ice Age by some combination of Beringian occupation, coastal movement, inland opportunity, and repeated adaptation. They do not merely arrive, they spread, diversify, and endure. And with that, one of the last great geographic thresholds is crossed. There is no ceremony, no moment of species-wide realization, no witness capable of understanding that the human line has now touched almost every major landmass on Earth. There are only camps, fires, tracks in mud, or snow tools left beside butchered bone children, learning the local names of unfamiliar animals, elders telling of places farther north or farther west that no longer matter, because life is here now. The world has become human not all at once, but one habitable landscape at a time. The next question is the largest of all: why this species and not the others comes to hold it so completely. By the time humans stand in Africa, Europe, Asia, Sahul, and the Americas, the old question of migration has turned into a new one, broader and more unsettling. Leaving Africa is no longer the mystery by itself. The greater mystery is why Homo sapiens goes so much farther than any other human species, and why the outcome is so complete. Neanderthals vanish. Denisovans vanish. Other archaic lineages fade from the record or survive only as traces in living genomes. Giant animals disappear from many landscapes not long after human arrival. Fire regimes change. Food webs shift. Coastlines, plains, forests, and islands begin to feel the pressure of one unusually adaptable primate. The species does not merely spread, it takes over. Not in a single dramatic moment and not for one single reason, but with a thoroughness that eventually leaves no rival human presence anywhere on Earth. It is tempting to explain this with one magical trait: language, intelligence, cooperation, technology, aggression, symbolic thought, planning depth. Each has been proposed as the decisive advantage. Each contains part of the truth. None is enough alone. Neanderthals are intelligent. Denisovans survive across immense territories. Other hominins use tools, fire, and social cooperation. The record does not support a simple fairy tale in which Homo sapiens possesses one shining mental gift, and therefore naturally inherits the world. No single explanation fully accounts for the scale of the success. The better answer is less tidy and more convincing. Humans take over because many strengths converge in one species at once, and those strengths reinforce one another under changing conditions. Flexibility sits near the center of that convergence. Homo sapiens is not the strongest human species, not always the best adapted to any one harsh environment, not necessarily the most physically imposing. Its advantage lies in being difficult to pin down ecologically. It can live by shorelines, in grasslands, in forests, in cold steppes, on islands, in deserts, and along river systems. It can shift prey. It can widen diet. It can modify shelter clothing tools, social spacing, and mobility patterns. In one place it becomes a coastal gatherer and fisher. In another a hunter of Ice Age herds. In another a woodland forager moving through dense vegetation. A specialist species can dominate one setting brilliantly and still disappear when that setting changes. A flexible species has a different kind of power. It survives by turning change itself into usable ground. Language, though elusive in its origins, likely magnifies this flexibility enormously. A species that can describe absent things, future risks, remembered routes, and inferred opportunities, carries far more than instinct into a new landscape. It carries portable simulation. A coastline beyond the headland can be imagined before it is seen. A migration path can be taught before it is walked. A medicinal plant can be named and remembered by people who are not yet sick. Social tension can be negotiated in advance rather than only through immediate conflict. Scholars still debate when language becomes fully modern and how visible that transition ought to be archaeologically, but the larger point seems hard to escape. Whatever exact form it takes, advanced communication lets humans move through the world with shared minds rather than isolated ones. Those shared minds are embedded in unusually dense social systems. This may be one of the most decisive differences of all. A small, brilliant, isolated population can still vanish. A species organized into larger, more connected, more exchange-rich networks is harder to erase. Ideas move farther, mates move farther, useful materials move farther. Knowledge survives local disasters. Children inherit more than the experience of one camp or one valley. In this sense, Homo sapiens may not simply be smarter than its relatives in any abstract way. It may be more connected. And connectivity is a form of resilience. When one group fails, others remain. When one route closes, another survives in memory. When one innovation appears, it has a better chance of circulating rather than dying with its inventors. Cumulative culture turns that resilience into momentum. This is a phrase often used, but its full force is easy to miss. It means that solutions do not remain trapped in single lifetimes. They accumulate, are modified, transmitted, combined, and reapplied under new conditions. Fire-making, hide preparation, hafting symbolic markers of belonging root memory, childcare practices, food processing, seasonal scheduling, and eventually watercraft or more specialized cold weather technology all become inherited advantages. The genius of Homo sapiens is not only invention, it is retention. A species that remembers well socially can move farther than one forced to rediscover too much each time. There is also the matter of scale. Once humans are established across multiple continents, the process begins to feed itself. More territory means more habitats learned, more local populations, more opportunities for splitting and branching, more independent experiments in survival. Some fail, others succeed spectacularly. but the species as a whole grows harder to constrain because it is no longer exposed to one regional crisis. A drought in one zone does not threaten the entire human future. A cooling event in one continent does not erase populations elsewhere. This wide distribution is itself an advantage one gained through earlier movement, and then converted into further power. Geography becomes insurance. One lesser known but important detail is how much human success may depend on tolerance for low-level imperfection. Many species are locked into relatively narrow behavioral repertoires that work extremely well until they do not. Humans are messier. They often survive with partial knowledge, improvised tools, rough shelters, mixed diets, and social friction that would seem unstable from the outside. Yet this very looseness can be adaptive. A species that requires perfect conditions is fragile. A species that can function amid error patchwork learning and uneven cooperation may spread more effectively in unpredictable worlds. Homo sapiens often looks overbuilt culturally for uncertainty, and uncertainty is exactly what the late Pleistocene keeps delivering. Why then do the others vanish? Here caution matters. It is easy to force the story into a moral drama of winners and losers, as if prehistory were a competition judged by destiny. The disappearance of Neanderthals and Denisovans is more likely the outcome of overlapping pressures than any simple defeat. Smaller populations are more vulnerable to climate swings, habitat fragmentation, inbreeding, and demographic bad luck. A species with broader networks and somewhat higher adaptability can gradually absorb space resources and opportunities even without open warfare on a grand scale. Gene flow complicates the picture further, because the vanishing humans do not disappear without contact. They are partly folded into the lineage that remains. Extinction in this case is entanglement followed by loss of independence. Human takeover also has ecological dimensions. In continent after continent, the arrival or spread of Homo sapiens broadly aligns with changes in large animal communities, fire patterns, vegetation structure, and predator-prey relations. The exact mechanism varies and remains debated. In some places, hunting pressure may matter more. In others, burning and habitat transformation. In still others, climate change may already be pushing ecosystems toward instability before humans intensify the pressure. No single explanation fully accounts for every regional pattern. But what survives in the record suggests a recurring truth. Humans are not just another animal entering an ecosystem. They are an ecosystem-altering force even as hunter-gatherers. That force comes partly from versatility and partly from social accumulation. A lion can kill. A human group can kill coordinate remember migration routes, revisit seasonal bottlenecks, alter plant communities with fire, and teach all of it across generations. The impact is not always immediate, and it should not be exaggerated into instant destruction everywhere. But over time the effect is profound. Many landscapes cease to be shaped only by climate geology and non-human species. They begin to be shaped by a creature that carries culture as an extension of biology. There is something almost paradoxical in this. Humans take over the world not because they are the most physically specialized for any one place, but because they are the least bound to one place. Their strength is not perfect fit, it is refit. Again and again they enter lands that should exclude them, and instead learn new timings, new foods, new dangers, new ways of keeping children alive. They can borrow from other humans genetically, perhaps behaviorally as well. They can survive failure in one area because they have succeeded in another. They can spread locally for reasons that are immediate and ordinary, while the cumulative effect becomes planetary. This does not make the outcome inevitable. It remains possible to imagine a world where Homo sapiens is one human species among several for far longer or where some climatic reversal and demographic weakness curtail its range. The fact that this does not happen should not be mistaken for necessity. It is still contingency, only contingency, that compounds in one lineage's favour for long enough to matter. That is why the story is so unsettling. Nothing supernatural occurs, no divine grant of dominion, no singular breakthrough, no single victorious battle. Instead, countless local advantages and survivals gather into an irreversible global pattern, and with that pattern the planet changes its character. For the first time in Earth's history, one large-brained social species begins to occupy almost every habitable region, while also reshaping the terms of life in those regions. The takeover is not complete in the modern sense yet. Agriculture has not begun. Cities, empires, industry, and the vast transformations of the Holocene still lie ahead. But the foundation is already in place. The world has become a human world because humans have become the one species able to keep turning the unfamiliar into the lived. That may be the deepest answer of all. Homo sapiens takes over the planet because it is the species that can keep arriving without ceasing to remain itself, and can remain itself while changing almost everything about how it lives. It carries memory across landscapes, cooperation across generations, and possibility across thresholds. The world does not yield to it in one act. The world yields piece by piece, habitat by habitat, until one day there is almost nowhere left that has not learned the shape of human presence. In the end, the most important consequence of leaving Africa is not simply that humans reach new land. It is that they cease to be a local species altogether. For millions of years, the human line is an African story, rich, complex, and already immense within that continent. Then, over tens of thousands of years, one branch of that story begins to move outward and does not stop. It passes through bottlenecks, deserts, green corridors, contested frontiers, cold steppes, tropical coasts, island chains, and northern thresholds of ice. It meets other humans and outlasts them. It enters continents where no human has ever been. It alters ecosystems, carries memory across impossible distances, and slowly converts the habitable world into human range. That transformation is so complete that modern people often forget how strange it is. Humanity now feels global by nature. In truth, becoming global is the single most consequential thing our species ever did. To become a global species is to change the scale of human life in ways deeper than geography alone. Once populations are established across Africa, Eurasia, Sahul, and the Americas, human experience is no longer bounded by one climatic regime, one set of animals, one sky, or one inherited ecological script. Different communities begin to live under radically different conditions, while remaining recognizably part of the same species. Some follow reindeer beneath the long winter light of Ice Age Eurasia. Some move through tropical coastlines and river systems. Some adapt to arid interiors, some to high mountains, some to forests dense enough to swallow horizons. The result is not one human world, but many human worlds unfolding at once, linked only by deep ancestry and the portable habits that made them possible. This is where the story becomes larger than migration. Once humans occupy the planet in this scattered but durable way, every later chapter of history becomes possible. Agriculture will arise in several places because humans are already present in several places long enough to experiment with plants, animals, and seasonal settlement. Different languages will proliferate because populations are widespread, separated, and locally adapted. Myth, ritual exchange, conflict, innovation, and identity will all take forms shaped by landscapes that earlier humans had never reached. The seeds of future civilizations lie not only in farming or metallurgy, but in this older dispersal that placed Homo sapiens in so many ecological theatres to begin with. The consequences are biological as well as cultural. Once humans spread across vastly different environments, natural selection continues to work on local populations in ways both subtle and dramatic. Skin pigmentation shifts under different light regimes. Body proportions respond in part to climate and energy balance. High-altitude adaptations emerge in mountain populations, some drawing on Denisovan ancestry. Immune systems are shaped by local disease ecologies. Diets influence physiology. Yet what is striking is not merely that humans change, it is how much change can occur within one species without breaking it apart again into separate human kinds. Homo sapiens remains one species while becoming astonishingly varied. That unity in diversity is itself one of the enduring legacies of the Great Dispersal. At the same time, global spread carries a darker inheritance. The human species does not only occupy ecosystems, it transforms them. In Australia, in the Americas, on islands across later prehistory, and eventually everywhere, human arrival often coincides with ecological upheaval. Fire regimes shift. Large animals decline. Predators lose ground. Plant communities change under burning hunting transport and disturbance. The scale of these effects remains debated from region to region, and no single explanation fully accounts for every extinction or environmental transition. Climate is often entangled with human action in difficult ways, but what survives in the record suggests a sobering truth. Even before agriculture and industry, humans are already becoming a geological and biological force. There is also the consequence of solitude. When Homo sapiens leaves Africa and takes over the world, it does not merely expand, it becomes the last human species standing. For most of the deep past, there is a plurality of humans. Different lineages share the earth. By the later stages of the Great Expansion, that plurality narrows toward one. Neanderthals disappear. Denisovans disappear. Other archaic populations vanish or survive only as faint genetic traces. The human world becomes less diverse in one profound sense, at the same time that Homo sapiens becomes more widespread and internally varied. This is one of the strangest paradoxes in our story. We become global by first becoming alone. That loneliness may help explain something about later human behavior. A species without living human rivals can easily mistake itself for the natural endpoint of history. It can imagine that the world was always meant for one kind of human mind and one kind of human presence. The prehistoric record tells a different story. Our dominance is recent, contingent, and costly. We inherit the world not from emptiness, but from relatives we met, mixed with, and outlasted. We inherit it too from ecosystems shaped for millions of years without us, and then abruptly forced to reckon with us. If there is a lesson hidden in the deep past, it may be that human uniqueness is real, but it is not simple, and it is not innocent. One lesser known but revealing consequence of global spread is that memory itself becomes geographic. Once the species is distributed across continents, people begin to carry different deep relationships to place relationships that can last astonishingly long. In Australia, evidence increasingly suggests extraordinary continuity of cultural connection to land across vast spans of time. In the Americas, in Africa, in Eurasia, local groups accumulate intimate knowledge tied to rivers, mountains, migration paths, sacred sites, and seasonal rhythms. The global species is not uprooted in any permanent sense. On the contrary, by spreading everywhere, humans become capable of rooting deeply almost anywhere. That ability to turn movement into belonging may be the most human trait of all. And yet, even as belonging deepens locally, the larger fact remains. The planet is now threaded with human presence. No other animal of our size, intelligence, and social complexity has ever ranged so far while carrying so much learned life with it. Wolves spread widely. Birds migrate over continents, marine mammals cross oceans, but none of them transport cumulative symbolic culture, adaptive technology, and ecological transformation in the same way. Homo sapiens does not merely occupy the world physically. It overlays the world with stories, names, roots, taboos, kinship systems, and remembered meanings. A valley becomes a hunting ground, an ancestral place, a sacred place, a dangerous place, a place of return. Geography becomes humanized not just by use but by memory. That is why takeover can be misleading if it sounds too triumphant or too blunt. Humans do not seize the earth in one dramatic act. They settle into it, alter it, interpret it, inherit it, and are altered by it in return. Their success lies not in perfect domination, but in relentless accommodation. They keep finding ways to live through different forms of uncertainty until the accumulation of those solutions produces a global result. The world becomes human not because humans master every environment instantly, but because they keep refusing final exclusion from any of them. The deeper consequence is that history itself changes character. Once one species spans the globe, local events can eventually become species-wide consequences, even if that takes millennia to emerge fully. A shift in climate, a new subsistence strategy, a technological breakthrough, a pathogen, an animal domestication, a navigational skill, any of these can in time move through or reshape populations across enormous distances. That possibility begins here in the dispersal. A regional primate becomes a planetary actor. Agriculture empires, religions, trade networks, pandemics, colonization, science, fossil fuel burning, and the modern transformation of the biosphere all rest on that older threshold crossing. Before humans can change the world, they must first be everywhere in it. So why did humans leave Africa and take over the entire world? Because Africa produced a species shaped by instability, built for learning and unusually capable of carrying culture as a survival tool. Because climate opened doors and sometimes slammed them shut. Because many early attempts failed and the species kept trying anyway. Because coast rivers, grasslands, and ice age corridors turned distance into a sequence of solvable problems. Because humans could cooperate, imagine, remember, and adapt faster than most environments could exclude them. Because once they were spread widely enough, success began to reinforce itself. And because every new place entered became not only another habitat, but another source of knowledge for going farther still. In the beginning, there is only Africa vast enough to shape the species and varied enough to prepare it. In the end, there is a planet of human fires under different constellations, each one local, each one connected by descent to those first restless populations in the old African landscapes. The journey does not make humans less tied to place. It multiplies the number of places that can become human home. That is how the species takes over the world, not as a conqueror descending all at once, but as a traveller so adaptable that almost every habitable landscape eventually learns its footprint,